My wife said she respects only people she loves, and I'm not one of them. So I changed the locks, canceled every privilege in my name, and called her father pickup was tonight. No one argued. Well, here's the thing about second chances. They're like buying a lottery ticket after you've already been screwed over by the first one. You know the odds are garbage, but hope makes you stupid, and stupid makes you optimistic. My name is Marcus Hale, and at 42, I thought I had this whole learning from mistakes thing figured out. Spoiler alert, I absolutely did not. 3 years ago, I met Isabella at one of those fancy charity events where rich people write checks to feel better about their existential dread. You know the type: overpriced champagne, silent auctions for trips to Tuscany that nobody actually wants to take, and enough fake smiles to power a small town. I was there because my company expected it. She was there because, well, I never really figured out why she was there. Maybe she smelled opportunity the way sharks smell blood in the water. Isabella was the kind of woman who didn't just walk into a room, she commanded it. Magnetic doesn't even begin to cover it. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person worth talking to, even when you could see other guys orbiting around her like planets around the sun. Her laugh was infectious. Her smile could melt steel, and when she looked at you with those dark eyes, it felt like she was seeing straight through to your soul. Of course, what I thought was deep connection was probably just her calculating my net worth. But hey, hindsight is 20/20 and love makes you blind as a bat. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Here I was, a divorced dad with more baggage than a cross-country flight. And this incredible woman was actually interested in me. Not just interested, she seemed genuinely excited about building something together. She talked about family dinners, weekend trips, maybe even kids of our own someday. It was like someone had handed me a script for the life I'd always wanted but never thought I'd get a second shot at. Now, let me be clear about my situation going into this romantic comedy turned horror movie. I had 2 kids from my first marriage: Clara, who's 11 and sharp as a tack, and Jonah, who's 9 and has enough energy to power a nuclear reactor. My ex-wife Sarah and I had managed to split without completely destroying each other or traumatizing the kids too badly, which in today's world basically makes us candidates for sainthood. The kids spent half their time with me, half with her, and I was doing my best to be the kind of dad who shows up to every soccer game and still remembers to pack lunches that don't consist entirely of Pop-Tarts and good intentions. Isabella came into this ready-made family situation like she was born for it. She didn't have kids of her own, but she had big dreams about what we could build together. She talked about being a stepmom like it was her calling, about creating traditions and memories, about giving Clara and Jonah the stable, loving home they deserved. She painted this picture of Sunday morning pancakes and family game nights and vacations to Disney World where nobody fights about money or whose turn it is to change a diaper. And me, I bought into it hook, line, and sinker. Because when you've been through a divorce, especially one that left you questioning whether you're actually capable of making anyone happy, meeting someone who seems to believe in your potential feels like winning the emotional lottery. Isabella made me feel like I wasn't just some divorced dad trying to figure out how to microwave dinosaur chicken nuggets without setting off the smoke alarm. I was a man worth loving, worth building a life with. So I gave her everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Financial stability? Check. I paid for her to go back to school and get her graduate degree in marketing, because she said she wanted to build something meaningful and contribute to our future. That little investment set me back about 40 grand, but I figured it was an investment in us, in our shared dreams, in the woman I was planning to spend the rest of my life with. The house? Yeah, I bought us a house. Not just any house. A 4-bedroom colonial in one of those neighborhoods where the homeowners association sends you passive-aggressive letters if your grass is half an inch too long. It had a big backyard for the kids, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and enough space for all of us to spread out and be comfortable. I put both our names on the deed because, hey, we were building a life together, right? And then there was her family. Oh, her family. The Morenos treated me like their personal ATM from day one. But I was so busy being in love and feeling grateful that someone like Isabella chose me that I didn't see the red flags until they were practically slapping me in the face. When her parents needed help with their mortgage after her dad's retirement didn't go as planned, guess who stepped up? When her sister Gabrielle needed someone to co-sign for her car loan because her credit was trashed, Guess who got voluntold to help out? Every family emergency, every financial crisis, every just this once request landed on my doorstep with a smile and a promise that they'd pay me back eventually, that I thought I was being a good husband, a good son-in-law, a good man. I thought effort and generosity and showing up every single day would build the kind of love that lasts. I thought that if I just tried hard enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, I could create the perfect family I'd always wanted. I thought love was something you could earn through sheer determination and an open wallet. But here's what nobody tells you about effort. It's only valuable when the other person recognizes it, appreciates it, and reciprocates it. When someone takes your effort for granted, when they start to see your sacrifices as their entitlements, when your generosity becomes an expectation rather than a gift, you're not building love. You're building resentment on both sides and setting yourself up for the kind of fall that leaves you wondering how you got so lost. Sometimes the people who don't want to see your effort are determined to stay blind to it, no matter how bright you try to shine. You know how they say the devil is in the details? Well, turns out the devil also lives in casual conversations over morning coffee and arguments about who forgot to pay the electric bill. The thing about marriage falling apart is that it doesn't happen all at once like in the movies. There's no dramatic music, no rain-soaked confrontation in a parking lot. Instead, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one so small you barely notice until you're bleeding out on your own kitchen floor. The cracks in our perfect little suburban dream started showing up about 6 months after we moved into the house. At first, they were hairline fractures, the kind of thing you could convince yourself was normal relationship stuff. Every couple has their issues, right? Every marriage goes through rough patches. I was a divorced guy, so I knew that relationships took work, that love wasn't always butterflies and rainbow unicorns farting glitter. But Isabella's issues weren't the normal, "You never put the toilet seat down," or "Why do you leave your socks on the bathroom floor?" complaints that most couples navigate. No, Isabella had a special talent for making comparisons that felt like psychological warfare disguised as casual conversation. She'd mention her ex-boyfriend Derek, who apparently was some kind of cross between Ryan Gosling and a motivational speaker. According to Isabella, Derek was passionate, the kind of guy who would surprise her with weekend trips to Napa Valley and write her poetry that didn't suck. Then there was Miguel, who was charming and could make her laugh until her sides hurt. Miguel apparently had this way of making every day feel like an adventure, even if they were just going grocery shopping or binge-watching Netflix on a Sunday afternoon. Isabella would get this dreamy look in her eyes when she talked about how Miguel could turn a mundane Tuesday into something magical just by being himself. And let's not forget about Jason, the ambitious one who was apparently destined to change the world one brilliant business idea at a time. Jason had vision. Jason had drive. Jason had the kind of magnetic personality that made everyone want to be around him. Jason also, coincidentally, never seemed to have any actual money. But Isabella glossed over that little detail whenever she brought up his many wonderful qualities to IT. First, I tried to be understanding about these trips down memory lane. Look, I'm not an idiot. I know that everyone has a past, and I didn't expect Isabella to pretend that I was her first relationship or that she'd never cared about anyone before me. Hell, I had my own history with Sarah, and there were things about my ex-wife that I still respected and appreciated. But there's a difference between acknowledging your past and using it as a weapon against your present. Every time Isabella brought up one of these paragons of masculine perfection, I felt a little smaller, a little less adequate, a little more like the consolation prize she'd settled for when the really good guys got away. I started second-guessing everything, the way I dressed, the way I talked, whether I was interesting enough or funny enough or spontaneous enough to keep her attention. I bought books on being more charismatic, started planning surprise date nights, even considered taking salsa dancing lessons because apparently Miguel was an amazing dancer that I told myself it was just insecurity talking. That Isabella didn't mean anything by these comparisons. Maybe she was just sharing her life with me, trying to help me understand who she was and how she'd gotten there. Maybe I was being too sensitive, reading malice into what was probably just nostalgia. After all, she'd chosen me, right? She'd said yes when I proposed. She'd moved into our house. She was building a life with me and the kids. Actions speak louder than words, and her actions said she wanted to be with me. But then came that night in November when everything shifted, when the paper cuts finally hit something vital, and I started hemorrhaging all over our brand new hardwood floors. We'd been arguing about money, specifically about how Isabella's credit card bills had somehow ballooned to the point where the minimum payments were eating up a significant chunk of our monthly budget. I wasn't trying to be controlling or unreasonable. I just wanted to understand how someone could spend $3,000 at Target in a single month. Like, what do you even buy at Target that costs $3,000? Did she purchase the entire houseware section? Was she stockpiling toilet paper for the apocalypse? Isabella got defensive, which I should have expected, but instead of just admitting that maybe she'd gone a little overboard with the retail therapy, she started attacking me for being cheap and controlling and obsessed with money. She accused me of trying to micromanage her life, of treating her like a child who couldn't be trusted with a credit card. She said I was sucking all the joy out of our relationship by constantly worrying about stupid things like budgets and financial responsibility. That I tried to stay calm, tried to explain that I wasn't trying to control her, that I was just concerned about our financial future, especially with 2 kids to think about. I reminded her that we had goals. We talked about maybe having a baby together someday, about taking family vacations, about saving for Clara and Jonah's college funds. All of that required some level of financial planning and restraint. That's when she looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not angry, not hurt, just cold and matter-of-fact, like she was explaining something obvious to someone particularly dense. The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees as she delivered the words that would replay in my head for months afterward. "I only respect people I love," she said, her voice steady and emotionless. "And you're not one of them." The silence that followed was deafening. Not the kind of silence that falls between people who are too angry to speak, but the kind that happens when someone has just dropped a nuclear bomb in the middle of your living room, and you're still trying to figure out if you're dead or alive. I stood there like an idiot, trying to process what she'd just said, trying to find some way to misinterpret or misunderstand words that were pretty damn unambiguous. She didn't say it in the heat of anger, didn't scream it or throw it at me like verbal shrapnel. She said it calmly, like she was commenting on the weather or telling me we were out of milk. I looked at this woman who was wearing the engagement ring I'd spent 2 months' salary on, who was standing in the house I'd bought for us, who'd eaten the dinner I'd cooked an hour earlier, and I realized I was staring at a complete stranger. Or maybe I was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. In that moment, everything clicked into place with horrible, crystal-clear precision. I wasn't her husband. I was her placeholder. I wasn't her partner. I was her convenience. All those comparisons to Derek and Miguel and Jason suddenly made perfect sense because they were the men she'd actually loved, actually respected. I was just the guy who paid the bills. Ever notice how once someone shows you who they really are, you can't unsee it? It's like one of those optical illusion pictures where you're staring at what looks like a vase, and then someone points out the 2 faces looking at each other, and suddenly you can't see the vase anymore no matter how hard you try. That's what happened after Isabella's little truth bomb in our kitchen. Suddenly, I had X-ray vision for all the bullshit I'd been willfully ignoring for 3 years. The morning after our "I don't respect you" conversation, I woke up expecting some kind of acknowledgement from Isabella. Maybe an apology, maybe an attempt to walk back what she'd said. Hell, even just some awkwardness about having nuked our marriage from orbit the night before. Instead, she was sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened, sipping coffee from the mug I'd bought her that said, "World's Best Wife." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Morning," she said without looking up, like she hadn't just casually informed me that our entire relationship was built on a foundation of her complete and utter lack of respect for me as a human being. That's when I started really paying attention to the little things I'd been brushing off as quirks or personality differences. Like how Isabella had this charming habit of cutting me off mid-sentence whenever we were talking to other people, usually to correct something I'd said or add her own commentary that completely derailed whatever point I was trying to make. I'd always told myself she was just enthusiastic, just eager to contribute to the conversation. Turns out, what I'd interpreted as enthusiasm was actually her way of letting everyone know that my opinions weren't worth listening to. Take our dinner party the previous weekend with the Johnsons from down the street. I was telling them about this documentary I'd watched about sustainable farming, and Isabella literally held up her hand like a traffic cop and said, "Oh, Marcus is on one of his environmental kicks again. Did you guys see that new Netflix series about the serial killer in Wisconsin?" Just completely steamrolled right over me like I was some boring uncle at Thanksgiving that everyone tolerates but doesn't actually want to hear from. And the eye rolling. Jesus, the eye rolling. I started keeping a mental tally of how many times Isabella's eyes did a full 360 whenever I asked her for what I thought were perfectly reasonable things. "Could you pick up my dry cleaning since you're going to be near the strip mall anyway?" I roll. "Would you mind not leaving your coffee cups all over the house for me to collect like some kind of caffeinated Easter egg hunt?" I roll. "Do you think we could maybe discuss major purchases before you make them?" I roll so dramatic it probably registered on the Richter scale, but the real education and how little respect I commanded in my own house came from watching how the Moreno family treated me. Isabella's parents had never exactly rolled out the red carpet for me, but I chalked that up to normal protective parent stuff. Every father thinks no man is good enough for his precious daughter, right? Every mother-in-law has opinions about how her daughter could have done better. I figured they'd warm up to me eventually once they saw how much I loved Isabella and how well I provided for her. Richard Moreno, Isabella's father, was a retired judge who carried himself like he was still presiding over cases from his lazy-boy recliner. The man had perfected the art of looking at me like I was something he'd accidentally stepped in during his morning walk. Every conversation, we had felt like a cross-examination where I was both the defendant and already guilty of whatever crime he'd decided I'd committed. He had this way of asking questions that weren't really questions, more like statements designed to make me feel inadequate. "So Marcus, still working at that little consulting firm?" Little consulting firm. Like the company that employed 30 people and had been in business for 15 years was some kind of lemonade stand I was running out of my garage. "How's that house payment treating you?" "Pretty steep for someone in your situation." My situation being, apparently, not being wealthy enough to buy a house outright with cash like some kind of suburban drug lord. "Isabella tells me you've been doing the cooking lately." "That's modern of you." Modern. Like me making dinner for my own family was some kind of radical feminist experiment instead of just basic adult responsibility. And Gabrielle, Isabella's sister, was even worse because she wrapped her passive-aggressive bullshit in fake sweetness that made it harder to call out directly. Gabrielle had mastered the art of the backhanded compliment, the kind of comment that sounds almost nice until you really think about what she's saying. "Oh, Marcus, you're so good to Isabella. She's so lucky to have found someone who doesn't mind that she's out of his league." "Thanks, Gabrielle. Really appreciate you pointing out that I'm dating up while simultaneously making it sound like charity work. It must be nice for Isabella to not have to worry about money anymore. I mean, after all those years of dating guys who were too proud to take care of a woman properly." Translation: you're not too proud because you don't have anything to be proud of, but at least you're useful. You know, Marcus, some men would be intimidated by Isabella's education and success, but you seem really comfortable with it. Comfortable with it. Like I should be threatened by my wife's graduate degree that I paid for. For 3 years, I'd endured this death by 1,000 cuts, telling myself that family relationships take time to develop, that they'd eventually accept me, that I was being too sensitive or reading too much into innocent comments. But once Isabella confirmed that I wasn't someone she loved or respected, all those little slights and microaggressions suddenly looked different. They weren't the growing pains of blending families. They were the natural result of everyone involved recognizing that I was the weak link in the chain. The worst part wasn't even the disrespect itself. It was the realization that I'd been complicit in my own degradation. Every time Richard made some snide comment about my career, I'd laugh it off or try to prove him wrong instead of telling him to shove his opinions where the sun doesn't shine. Every time Gabrielle delivered one of her sugar-coated insults, I'd smile and nod like she was giving me a compliment instead of calling her out for being a manipulative bitch. Every time Isabella dismissed me in front of other people, I'd make excuses for her behavior instead of demanding the basic respect that every human being deserves. I'd been so desperate to make this family work, so grateful to be included in their little circle, that I'd allowed them to treat me like hired help instead of like the man who was keeping their precious Isabella housed, fed, educated, and financially secure. I'd mistaken tolerance for acceptance and submission for peace, but tolerance isn't acceptance, submission isn't peace, and being useful isn't the same thing as being valued. Once I understood that distinction, everything else started to make sense. You know what's funny about rock bottom? It's not actually the worst place to be. Rock bottom is solid ground, and sometimes that's exactly what you need to push off from to start swimming back to the surface. That Friday night, sitting in my home office while Isabella cackled at some TikTok video in the living room like she hadn't just blown up our marriage 48 hours earlier, I finally hit that solid ground. It was one of those November evenings where winter is knocking on the door but hasn't quite moved in yet. The kids were at Sarah's for the weekend, which meant the house had that weird quiet feeling it gets when there's no one around asking for snacks every 5 minutes or arguing about whose turn it is to walk the dog we don't even have. Just me, Isabella, and the sound of her completely ignoring my existence while I paid all the bills that made her comfortable lifestyle possible. I'd been going through our monthly expenses, which had become about as fun as getting a root canal without anesthesia. Isabella's spending had reached levels that would make a Kardashian blush. $3,000 at Target was apparently just the tip of the iceberg. There was also the $1,500 at Sephora because apparently she needed enough makeup to supply a small theater company. The $800 at Lululemon because regular yoga pants don't cost enough to make you feel superior to other people, and my personal favorite, the $1,200 she'd spent on something called wellness coaching, which, as far as I could tell, involved paying some woman with a fake British accent to tell her that her chakras were misaligned. But here's the thing about that Friday night. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is hot and messy and makes you do stupid things like throw dishes or write passive-aggressive notes that you leave on the refrigerator. What I felt was something completely different. It was cold and clear and sharp as a surgical knife. It was the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself about what's really going on. I pulled out a yellow legal pad. Old school, I know, but there's something about writing things down by hand that makes them more real than typing them on a computer. At the top of the page, I wrote, monthly expenses, Marcus Hale pays for. Then I started making a list, and let me tell you, it was like watching a horror movie where you're screaming at the protagonist to not go into the basement, except I was both the protagonist and the person watching. The mortgage, $2,800 a month for a house that Isabella got to live in while contributing exactly $0 toward. Utilities, gas, electric, water, trash, internet, cable. Another $400 a month, so Isabella could keep the house at a tropical 75 degrees in winter while binge-watching reality shows about rich women throwing drinks at each other. Cell phones. Both lines, naturally, because God forbid Isabella should have to figure out how to pay for her own communication device. That was another $160 a month for the privilege of receiving text messages about how I was failing as a husband. Car insurance. Isabella's BMW wasn't going to insure itself, and apparently her driving record was about as stellar as her respect for me. Another $180 a month. Streaming services. Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Disney+, HBO Max, Apple TV, and something called Peacock that I was pretty sure was just NBC, trying to make me pay for shows I could watch for free. Isabella had to have access to every piece of entertainment content ever created, which cost us about $60 a month. Her gym membership, $200 a month for a fancy place with eucalyptus towels and sparkling water on tap, because apparently breaking a sweat at Planet Fitness like a normal person would have been beneath her newly refined sensibilities. The credit cards. This was the big one. The financial equivalent of a tumor that kept growing no matter how much money I threw at it. Between the minimum payments on her various plastic fantastic adventures, I was looking at about $800 a month just to keep her from completely destroying our credit score. Her student loans. Remember that graduate degree I so generously financed? Well, it turns out that even though I paid for the tuition out of pocket, Isabella had still taken out loans for living expenses, which apparently meant maintaining her lifestyle while pretending to be a poor student. Another $300 a month. I sat there staring at this list, doing the math in my head, and realized that I was spending almost $5,000 a month just to subsidize the lifestyle of someone who had recently informed me that I wasn't worthy of her love or respect. $5,000. That's $60,000 a year. $60,000 annually to bankroll my own emotional abuse. But here's what really got me. It wasn't just the money. Money is just paper, just numbers on a screen, just a tool that you can earn more of if you're willing to work for it. What really twisted the knife was the realization that Isabella had never once, not even once, acknowledged that any of this was a gift. She didn't see my financial support as generosity or sacrifice or even basic partnership. She saw it as her due, her entitlement, her natural right as my wife to have me fund her existence while she treated me like something she'd scraped off her chute. I thought about all those conversations we'd had about money over the years, how she'd accused me of being controlling whenever I suggested that maybe we should have a budget, how she'd rolled her eyes when I tried to talk about saving for the future, how she'd made me feel like some kind of miser for wanting to understand where our money was going. She'd weaponized my own generosity against me, made me feel guilty for even questioning expenses that would have made a lottery winner nervous. And suddenly, sitting there in my office with that yellow legal pad and the sound of Isabella's laughter echoing from the living room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, not vindication, just a deep, bone-level calm that comes when you finally understand what needs to be done. If Isabella didn't see me as someone worthy of love or respect, then why was I acting like someone obligated to provide for her every want and need? If I was just a paycheck to her, a convenient source of funding for her lifestyle, then what exactly was I getting out of this arrangement besides the privilege of being emotionally neglected by someone with expensive taste? For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't trying to figure out how to make Isabella happy, or how to earn her affection, or how to prove that I was worthy of her love. I was simply recognizing a basic economic principle. You don't continue to invest in something that gives you no return, that I would no longer finance my own disrespect. There's something almost therapeutic about burning bridges when you finally realize they only led to places you never wanted to go in the first place. That Saturday morning, while Isabella was still sleeping off whatever wine and Netflix combo had kept her up until 2 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, my laptop, and a sense of purpose that felt better than any antidepressant Big Pharma ever cooked up. That I'd made my decision. But now came the fun part, the execution. And let me tell you, there's a special kind of satisfaction that comes from methodically dismantling the financial safety net of someone who's spent years treating you like their personal ATM, while simultaneously letting you know that you're not good enough to deserve their basic human decency. First up, the cell phone. Isabella's iPhone was practically surgically attached to her hand, which made it the perfect place to start. I called Verizon and explained that I wanted to remove a line from our family plan. The customer service rep, bless her heart, tried to talk me out of it. "Are you sure, Mr. Hale? You'll lose the family plan discount, and it might actually cost you more to have just one line." "I'm absolutely positive," I told her, "and I need this to take effect immediately." "Well, we can do it right now, but the other phone will lose service within the hour." "Perfect. That's exactly what I'm going for." Next was the streaming services. Isabella had insisted we needed every possible platform because, according to her, missing out on the latest true crime documentary or reality show about housewives throwing wine at each other would basically be cultural suicide. I logged into Netflix first and changed the password to something Isabella would never guess: "Respect is earned 2024. Then I did the same with Hulu, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Apple TV, and that weird Peacock thing that I was pretty sure nobody actually watched. The banking was a little trickier, but not by much. I called our credit card company and explained that I needed to freeze the cards associated with Isabella's name. The representative asked if they were lost or stolen. "Not lost," I said, "but definitely not authorized for use anymore." "Sir, I need to clarify. Are these cards that you're an authorized user on, or are you the primary account holder?" "I'm the primary account holder on everything. My wife is the authorized user, and I'm removing her authorization." There was a pause. "Okay, Mr. Hale, I can certainly do that for you. The cards will be deactivated within the next few minutes. Would you like us to issue you a new card with a different number?" "That would be fantastic." The car insurance took all of 3 minutes. Isabella's BMW was insured under my policy, and all it took was a phone call to remove her from coverage. The insurance agent asked if she'd be getting her own policy. "That's between her and whatever insurance company she chooses to go with," I said. "My responsibility for her driving ends today." The gym membership was almost too easy. I logged into the account online and canceled her membership effective immediately. The system asked if I wanted to provide a reason for cancellation. I typed, "no longer married," to someone who respects the person paying for their membership, but then deleted it and just selected moving from the drop-down menu. No point in being petty when you're already being thorough. By noon, I had systematically removed Isabella from every financial benefit she'd enjoyed as my wife. Every privilege, every convenience, every little luxury that she'd taken for granted was gone faster than a Kardashian marriage. And the beautiful thing was, it was all completely legal and totally within my rights. Amazing how much power you have over your own money when you finally decide to use it. I made myself a sandwich, turkey and Swiss on sourdough, nothing fancy, and sat back down at the kitchen table to wait. Isabella usually didn't surface until around 1 on weekends, which meant I had about an hour to mentally prepare for what was about to be either the most satisfying conversation of my marriage or the most nuclear argument we'd ever had. Possibly both. At exactly 1:15 p.m., I heard the shower turn on upstairs. Isabella's weekend routine was as predictable as clockwork. Wake up, spend 20 minutes scrolling through social media in bed, shower, spend another 20 minutes on her skincare routine that involved more products than a small pharmacy, then come downstairs expecting me to have coffee ready and probably some kind of elaborate brunch prepared. At 1:47 p.m., I heard her footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the kitchen wearing one of those athleisure outfits that cost more than most people's car payments. Her hair perfectly styled despite having just gotten out of the shower, looking like she was ready for a photo shoot for Women Who Marry Well magazine. "Morning, babe," she said, heading straight for the coffee maker without looking at me. "What's the plan for today?" "I was thinking we could go to that new brunch place downtown, maybe do some shopping after. Anthropologie is having a sale, and I saw this dress that would be perfect for the Morrisons' party next weekend." She grabbed her phone from the counter, and immediately her face scrunched up in confusion. "Weird, I'm not getting any signal. Is the Wi-Fi down or something?" "The Wi-Fi's fine," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Your phone line has been disconnected." She looked at me like I'd just told her that gravity had been canceled. "What do you mean disconnected?" "I mean I called Verizon this morning and removed your line from our plan. Your phone no longer has service." Isabella stared at me for a long moment, then let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Very funny, Marcus. What's really going on?" "That is what's really going on. I also changed the passwords on all the streaming services, froze your credit cards, canceled your car insurance, and terminated your gym membership. Effective immediately." The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might pass out. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." I stood up and walked over to where she was standing, close enough that she could see I wasn't joking, wasn't angry, wasn't having some kind of breakdown. I was just done. "You told me 2 nights ago that you only respect people you love, and that I'm not one of them. So I spent some time thinking about what that means, and I realized you're absolutely right. If I'm not someone you love or respect, then I'm also not someone who's obligated to finance your lifestyle." "Marcus, you're being ridiculous. You can't just..." "I can, and I did. Respect isn't free, Isabella. You want to be married to someone who pays for your phone, your credit cards, your insurance, your entertainment, your gym membership, and everything else? Then you need to be married to someone you actually respect. Since that's not me, according to you, then I'm not your provider anymore." She opened her mouth to argue, but for the first time in 3 years, absolutely nothing came out. And in that moment of stunned silence, I realized something beautiful. I was finally free. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of November day where the sky looks like it's been scrubbed clean and the air has that crisp bite that makes you feel more awake than any amount of caffeine ever could. I woke up before my alarm, which was unusual, but then again, everything about the last 48 hours had been unusual. Isabella had spent most of Saturday alternating between furious silence and tearful attempts to convince me that I was having some kind of midlife crisis breakdown, but I'd held firm. No negotiation, no discussion, no, let's work this out over couples therapy bullshit. The financial support was over, period, end of sentence, but cutting off the money was just the first step. Phase 2 was about to begin, and it required Isabella to be out of the house for a few hours. Fortunately, she'd made plans to go shopping with Gabrielle, probably to complain about what an unreasonable monster I'd turned into overnight, and to figure out how to guilt me back into funding her lifestyle. What she didn't know was that while she was gone, I was going to make sure that when she came back, She wouldn't be able to get back in at 9 a.m. sharp. A locksmith van pulled into my driveway. I'd called Rodriguez and Son Saturday night and paid extra for Sunday service, which told you something about how serious I was about this whole operation. Miguel Rodriguez was a stocky guy in his 50s who'd probably seen every kind of domestic drama you could imagine, and he had the kind of weathered face that said he didn't ask questions he didn't need answers to. "You want all the locks changed?" he asked, looking at the front door, the back door, and the side entrance that led into the garage. "Everything, and I need it done fast. My wife should be gone for about 3 hours, and I want this finished before she gets back." Miguel nodded like he'd heard this story 1,000 times before. "Deadbolts too. Deadbolts, doorknobs, everything. And I need 3 sets of keys. One for me, one for my daughter, and one for my son. What about your wife? She won't be needing keys." Miguel's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight raise of his eyebrow. "All right then. This'll take me about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours tops. You want the good stuff or the cheap stuff?" "The good stuff. Money's no object for this particular project." While Miguel worked on transforming my house into Fort Knox, I tackled the next item on my agenda: packing Isabella's belongings. Now, I want to be clear here. I wasn't throwing her stuff in garbage bags and dumping it on the lawn like some kind of redneck Jerry Springer episode. I'm not a savage. I went to Target, bought a bunch of those clear plastic storage containers, and methodically packed everything that belonged to her with the same care I'd shown her for 3 years. The care she'd never appreciated or acknowledged, but care nonetheless. Her clothes filled 8 containers. 8. I'm talking about enough outfits to supply a small boutique, including shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent and handbags that probably had their own insurance policies. Her makeup and skincare products filled 2 more containers, and I swear some of those little jars cost more per ounce than gold. Her books, her knickknacks, her collection of candles that all smelled like vanilla bourbon or autumn leaves, or whatever scent was supposed to make you feel sophisticated. Everything went into containers, labeled with a black Sharpie in my neatest handwriting. The jewelry was trickier. Obviously, her engagement ring and wedding band were hers to keep, along with all the other jewelry she'd accumulated over the years. But there were a few pieces I'd given her for birthdays and anniversaries that had more sentimental value than monetary value, and I found myself hesitating over those. Then I remembered her words from Thursday night. "I only respect people I love, and you're not one of them." And into the container they went. If I wasn't someone she respected, then gifts from me probably didn't mean much to her anyway. Miguel finished with the locks. At 11:30, tested each one twice, and handed me 3 sets of shiny new keys. "You want me to stick around?" he asked. "Sometimes these situations get complicated." "No, but I appreciate the offer. I think I can handle it from here." "All right then. Good luck, man." After he left, I arranged Isabella's containers in neat rows on the front porch, covered them with a tarp in case it rained, and then went inside to wait. The house felt different somehow, lighter, like someone had opened all the windows and let out 3 years' worth of stale air. I made myself a sandwich, opened a beer even though it wasn't even noon yet, and sat down in my living room to think about what I was going to say when Isabella came home at 2:15 p.m. My phone rang. Isabella's name popped up on the screen, which was ironic considering her phone didn't actually have service anymore. She must have been using Gabrielle's phone or maybe the Wi-Fi at whatever coffee shop they'd landed in to lick their wounds and plot their counterattack. "Marcus," she said, and I could hear the barely controlled panic in her voice. "I can't get in the house." "That's correct." There was a pause, like she was trying to process the fact that I'd actually followed through on something for once instead of just threatening and then backing down like I usually did. "What do you mean?" "That's correct. I mean exactly what I said yesterday. You told me you don't love or respect me, which means I'm not your provider anymore. And if I'm not your provider, then this isn't your house." "Marcus, this is insane. You can't lock me out of my own home. Actually, it's not your home. Your name might be on the deed, but you've never paid a dime toward the mortgage, the utilities, the insurance, or any other expense associated with this property. Legally and practically, this is my house that I was generously allowing you to live in. That generosity has now expired." I could hear Gabrielle in the background, probably coaching Isabella on what to say, or maybe calling her own husband to complain about what an unreasonable bastard I was being. "Where am I supposed to go?" Isabella asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely scared. I honestly don't know, and frankly, it's not my problem to solve anymore. But I will say this. Your belongings are packed neatly on the front porch, covered with a tarp so they won't get wet. I suggest you arrange to have them picked up soon. This is extreme, Marcus. Marriage is supposed to be about working through problems together. You're absolutely right. Marriage is supposed to be about mutual love, respect, and partnership. But you made it very clear that you don't love or respect me, which means we don't actually have a marriage. We have a financial arrangement that I've decided to terminate. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she spoke again, her voice smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever heard it. So that's it. You're just giving up on us. No, Isabella. You gave up on us a long time ago. I'm just finally accepting reality. If you've never had the pleasure of watching entitled people realize that their free ride is over, let me paint you a picture. It's like watching someone try to use an expired credit card at a luxury store. There's denial, then anger, then bargaining, then more anger, and finally a kind of stunned disbelief that the world doesn't actually revolve around them. I got a front row seat to this psychological circus at exactly 6:30 that evening when Richard Moreno's silver Lexus pulled into my driveway like he was arriving to foreclose on a mortgage. I'd been expecting this, of course. There was no way Isabella was going to handle this situation with any kind of dignity or self-reflection. No, she was going to run straight to Daddy and let him fight her battles for her, because that's what entitled people do when reality comes knocking. They call in the cavalry and hope that someone with more authority can bully the world back into the shape they prefer. Richard climbed out of his car wearing what I like to call his judge face, that stern, disapproving expression he'd perfected over 30 years on the bench, the one that was supposed to make you feel like you were guilty of something even if you'd never so much as jaywalked. Gabrielle emerged from the passenger side, looking like she was heading to a funeral, all black clothes and dramatic sunglasses, even though the sun was already setting. And Isabella, well, Isabella looked like someone who'd spent the day crying in coffee shops and getting her ego stroked by people telling her what a victim she was. I watched this little parade of dysfunction march up my front walk from my living room window, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete and total calm. No anxiety about confrontation, no desperate need to explain myself or justify my actions, no urge to apologize for finally standing up for myself. Just a deep, settled peace that comes from knowing you're absolutely, 100% in the right. The doorbell rang. I let it ring again. Then I heard Richard's voice through the door, using his courtroom tone like he was calling court to session. Marcus, open this door. We need to talk. I took my time walking to the front door, stopping to check my hair in the hallway mirror and straighten my shirt. When I opened the door, I was met with 3 faces that looked like they'd been expecting me to grovel and beg forgiveness. Instead, they got a man who looked like he'd just had the best night's sleep of his life. Richard, Gabrielle, Isabella. I nodded to each of them like I was greeting casual acquaintances. What can I do for you? Richard's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. What can you do for us? Marcus, this is absolutely unacceptable behavior. You cannot lock your wife out of her own home. Actually, I can and I did. And it's not her home. It's my home that I was allowing her to live in rent-free until she made it clear that she doesn't respect the person paying for her lifestyle. That's not how marriage works. Gabrielle jumped in, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. You don't just get to kick someone out because you had a fight. I looked at Gabrielle with the kind of patience you usually reserve for explaining basic math to a particularly slow kindergartner. We didn't have a fight, Gabrielle. Isabella made a very clear statement about her feelings regarding our relationship. I'm simply responding appropriately to that information. Isabella finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a whine than actual words. Marcus, please. You're being ridiculous. You can't expect me to take everything I said completely literally. Oh, but I can, I said, leaning against my doorframe with my arms crossed. See, when someone tells you they only respect people they love and that you're not one of them, that's what we call a definitive statement. It's not ambiguous. It's not open to interpretation. It's a clear declaration of how you view our relationship. Richard puffed himself up like an angry peacock. Marriage requires patience, Marcus. You work through problems, You don't abandon ship at the first sign of trouble. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The chance to explain basic human dignity to a man who'd spent his career supposedly upholding justice, but apparently never learned the difference between respect and tolerance. Patience, I said, looking Richard dead in the eye, is built on a foundation of mutual respect. Without respect, there's nothing to be patient about. There's just one person accepting poor treatment from another person who feels entitled to give it. But she's your wife. Gabrielle protested, like that title was some kind of magic spell that made abuse acceptable. Being someone's wife doesn't give you the right to treat them like garbage, I replied. And being someone's husband doesn't obligate you to fund your own disrespect indefinitely. Isabella stepped forward, and for a moment I thought she might actually apologize, might show some recognition of how her words and actions had brought us to this point. Instead, she went straight to emotional manipulation. You're abandoning me, Marcus. How can you just throw away 3 years like they meant nothing? The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a woman who'd just spent 3 years treating me like an ATM with legs, who'd explicitly told me she didn't love or respect me, who'd compared me unfavorably to every man she'd ever dated, now trying to make me feel guilty for refusing to continue subsidizing my own emotional abuse. I'm not throwing away anything, Isabella, I said, my voice steady and calm. You threw away our marriage the moment you decided I wasn't worth your respect. I'm simply acknowledging what you already made clear. We don't have a relationship based on love and mutual respect. We have a financial arrangement that I've chosen to terminate. This is cruel and unusual punishment. Richard bellowed, apparently forgetting that he was no longer in a courtroom and that marital disputes don't fall under the Eighth Amendment. No, I said, finally letting some steel creep into my voice. Cruel and unusual punishment is spending 3 years being told you're not good enough by someone whose entire lifestyle you're funding. Cruel and unusual punishment is having your contributions ignored, your efforts dismissed, and your worth measured solely by your ability to pay other people's bills. What I'm doing is called self-respect, and it's long overdue. Isabella's composure finally cracked completely. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? I gestured toward the neat rows of storage containers on my front porch, covered with the tarp to keep them dry. Your belongings are right there, packed carefully and ready for transport. As for where you go and what you do, that's entirely up to you. You're an adult with a graduate degree that I paid for. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You can't be serious about this, Richard said. But his bluster was starting to deflate as he realized that his intimidation tactics weren't working on someone who'd finally stopped caring about his approval. I'm completely serious. More serious than I've been about anything in years. I straightened up and prepared to deliver the closing argument. Isabella made a choice when she told me I'm not someone she loves or respects. I'm simply honoring that choice by removing myself from the position of supporting someone who views me with contempt. The silence that followed was beautiful. You know what's funny about small suburban neighborhoods? Information travels faster than gossip at a church potluck, and everyone suddenly becomes a marriage counselor with strong opinions about situations they know absolutely nothing about. By Monday morning, the news that Marcus Hale had locked his wife out of their house was making the rounds faster than a stomach bug at a daycare center. I discovered this delightful fact when I stepped outside to grab my newspaper. Yes, I still get the actual paper because I'm apparently ancient, and found my neighbor Janet Peterson practically lurking behind her mailbox like some kind of suburban spy. Janet was the self-appointed mayor of our little cul-de-sac, the kind of woman who knew everyone's business and felt personally responsible for maintaining what she called neighborhood standards, which was basically code for making sure nobody did anything that might lower property values or offend her delicate sensibilities. "Morning, Marcus," she called out, with that fake casual tone people use when they're fishing for information. "Everything okay? I saw Richard's car here yesterday evening, and there seemed to be some discussion happening on your front porch." Discussion. That was a polite way of describing what had essentially been a 3-person intervention designed to shame me back into financing Isabella's lifestyle, while she treated me like something she'd scraped off her designer shoes. "Everything's fine, Janet. Just working through some domestic issues." "Oh." She looked disappointed that I wasn't going to spill all the juicy details right there on the sidewalk at 7 in the morning. "Well, if you need anything. I mean, marriage can be so challenging these days." Translation: I'm dying to know what happened, and I'm going to spend the rest of the day calling every woman in the neighborhood to speculate about your personal life. That be why the time I got to work, my phone had already started buzzing with calls and texts from people who'd apparently heard various versions of the story. My buddy Dave from college sent a text that said simply, "Dude, did you really change the locks?" My sister called to ask if I was having a nervous breakdown. Even my ex-wife Sarah texted to ask if the kids should be concerned about their living situation when they were with me. The really interesting calls, though, came from people I hadn't heard from in months. Suddenly, everyone wanted to have lunch, grab a beer, or catch up, in ways that were obviously just excuses to get the real story straight from the source. It was like being a celebrity, except instead of being famous for something cool like making movies or hitting home runs, I was famous for finally growing a backbone at age 42. The reactions fell into predictable categories. There were the people who thought I was completely justified, usually other divorced guys who'd been through their own version of this particular hell. These were the men who'd had their contributions dismissed, their efforts ignored, their self-respect slowly eroded until they finally said enough was enough. They didn't need the details. They just needed to know that someone else had finally drawn a line in the sand and refused to let it be crossed. Then there were the people who thought I was being too harsh, too extreme, too unwilling to work on the relationship. These were mostly married women who'd apparently never been told by their spouse that they weren't worthy of love or respect, or men who'd been so thoroughly beaten down by their own relationships that they couldn't imagine standing up for themselves. They talked about compromise and communication and giving people second chances, as if I hadn't spent 3 years doing exactly that while Isabella systematically destroyed whatever respect I'd once had for myself. The most interesting reactions came from people who'd actually spent time around Isabella and me as a couple. These were the friends who'd watched her dismiss my opinions at dinner parties, who'd seen her roll her eyes when I spoke, who'd witnessed the way she treated me like hired help rather than a partner. They didn't need explanations because they'd been watching the slow-motion car wreck of our marriage from the beginning. That my friend Tom, whose wife Karen was part of Isabella's little social circle, called me Tuesday afternoon with what he described as intelligence from behind enemy lines. Karen came home from coffee with the girls yesterday, and apparently Isabella is painting herself as the victim of some kind of abusive husband who went crazy and kicked her out without warning, he said. But here's the thing. Karen has eyes, and she's been watching how Isabella treats you for 3 years. She told me that if some woman talked to her the way Isabella talks to you, she'd have divorced him before the appetizers arrived. This was validation I hadn't realized I needed. For so long, I'd wondered if I was being too sensitive, if I was misinterpreting Isabella's behavior, if maybe the problem really was me and my inability to make her happy. Hearing that other people had noticed the disrespect, had been uncomfortable watching it, made me realize that I hadn't been imagining things. But the most important reactions came from the two people whose opinions actually mattered, Clara and Jonah. The kids came to stay with me Wednesday evening, and I could tell immediately that they'd heard something. 11-year-old Clara has always been perceptive beyond her years, and 9-year-old Jonah picks up on emotional undercurrents like a bloodhound picks up scents. "Dad," Clara said while we were making dinner together, "Mom said Isabella moved out." "That's right, sweetheart. Isabella and I are having some problems, and we decided it would be better if she stayed somewhere else for a while. Are you getting divorced?" Jonah asked, looking up from his homework at the kitchen table. I paused, realizing this was one of those parenting moments where honesty was more important than protecting them from uncomfortable truths. "I don't know yet, buddy. We need to figure some things out first." What surprised me was their reaction. I'd expected questions, maybe some sadness about the disruption to their routine, possibly some concern about how this would affect their living situation. Instead, Clara nodded like this made perfect sense, and Jonah just went back to his math homework. Later that evening, while we were watching a movie, Clara curled up next to me on the couch and said something that nearly broke my heart. "Dad, you seem happier now." Out of the mouths of babes. My 11-year-old daughter had noticed something that apparently half the adults in my life had missed, that living with someone who doesn't respect you is like carrying a weight you don't even realize is there until it's gone. "I am happier, sweetheart. Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices to take care of themselves. Like when you told me I didn't have to be friends with Megan anymore after she was mean to me. Exactly like that. For the first time in months, maybe years, my kids saw their father as someone who wouldn't tolerate being treated poorly, someone who valued himself enough to walk away from a situation that was making him miserable. They saw strength instead of resignation, boundaries instead of endless accommodation. And that, more than anything else, told me I'd made the right choice. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for the universe to start delivering some poetic justice with a side of humble pie. 3 weeks of Isabella discovering what life looked like when you actually had to pay for your own phone bill, your own car insurance, your own overpriced lattes and wellness coaching sessions. 3 weeks of reality crashing into privilege like a freight train hitting a BMW. I heard about Isabella's new circumstances through the neighborhood gossip network, which was more efficient than the CIA when it came to gathering intelligence. Janet Peterson had apparently made it her personal mission to track Isabella's post-lockout life, like some kind of suburban war correspondent. According to Janet's sources, and let's be honest, Janet had sources everywhere. Isabella had moved in with Gabriel temporarily, which was already causing tension because Gabriel's husband wasn't thrilled about having his sister-in-law's drama disrupting his peaceful home life. But the real entertainment came when Isabella tried to maintain her previous lifestyle without my financial support. Apparently, she'd gone to Target expecting to drop her usual $1,000 on whatever caught her fancy, only to discover that her credit cards weren't just frozen, they were canceled. The cashier had to cut up her Visa right there at the register while a line of soccer moms watched the show. Janet described it as quite the spectacle, which in Janet's world was basically the equivalent of calling it a Category 5 disaster. Isabella had also tried to go to eucalyptus towels, only to be informed that her membership had been terminated and she'd need to pay the full initiation fee, plus monthly dues if she wanted to rejoin. Apparently, she'd made quite a scene about that too, demanding to speak to the manager and threatening to sue for discrimination. The manager, according to Janet's intelligence network, had politely explained that not paying your bills wasn't a protected class under civil rights law. The cell phone situation was particularly problematic because Isabella had apparently never bothered to learn my social security number or any of the account information needed to set up her own service. She'd been using Gabriel's phone for everything, which was causing its own set of issues since Gabriel's husband was getting tired of his wife's phone being tied up with Isabella's social life and job search drama. Yeah, job search. Turns out when you don't have someone else paying for your every need, you actually have to work for a living. Who could have predicted that shocking development? But the real wake-up call came when Isabella tried to find her own apartment. See, having your name on a deed doesn't mean much when you've never actually paid any of the associated expenses. Isabella had no credit history in her own name, no proof of income, no rental references, and no savings account because she'd spent every penny I'd ever given her on maintaining her lifestyle. Landlords, it turns out, want tenants who can actually pay rent, not tenants who can explain at length why their estranged husband should pay their rent. I learned all of this not because I was stalking Isabella's misfortunes, but because people kept calling to update me like I was following some kind of reality TV show. My buddy Tom was particularly good at gathering intelligence through Karen, who was still part of Isabella's social circle and therefore had front-row seats to the ongoing disaster. She tried to get a job at that marketing firm downtown, Tom reported during one of our weekly phone calls. Apparently, the interview didn't go well when they asked about her work experience, and she had to explain that she'd been focusing on her marriage for the past 3 years. Focusing on her marriage. That was a creative way to describe spending my money while treating me like I was beneath her notice. Yeah, and when they asked for references, she put down your name. They called you yesterday, didn't you get the message? I had gotten the message, actually. A very professional woman from Henderson Marketing had called to verify Isabella's employment history and character references. I'd been polite but honest. Isabella had never worked during our marriage. I'd financially supported her graduate education, and while she was intelligent and capable, I couldn't speak to her work ethic or professional reliability since I'd never observed either in a work context. I'd wished the company luck with their decision and hung up. Isabella didn't get the job, but the most interesting development came on a Thursday evening when my phone rang and Richard Moreno's name appeared on the screen. Not Isabella calling from someone else's phone, not Gabriel trying to mediate, Richard himself, calling me directly for the first time in 3 years. Marcus. His voice was different, less commanding, more tired. Richard, what can I do for you? There was a long pause, the kind of silence that happens when someone is swallowing their pride and finding it tastes worse than they expected. I wanted to talk to you about Isabella. Okay. She's struggling, Marcus. This whole situation has been very difficult for her. I waited. I wasn't going to make this easy for him by jumping in with reassurances or apologies. If Richard wanted to have this conversation, he was going to have to actually have it. She's living with Gabrielle, but that's not working out well. She can't find a job, can't get approved for an apartment, can't even get a decent cell phone plan because she has no credit history. That sounds challenging, I said, my voice carefully neutral. Marcus, I think I owe you an apology. Now that was unexpected. Richard Moreno apologizing to anyone was like finding a unicorn in your backyard. Theoretically possible, but not something you'd ever actually expect to witness. For what? For not understanding what you were dealing with. For treating you like you weren't good enough for our family when you were the one holding everything together. The silence stretched out between us, filled with 3 years of condescension, dismissal, and casual disrespect that we were both remembering. Isabella called me crying yesterday, he continued. She said she never realized how much you did for her until it was gone. She said she thought you'd always be there, that you'd always take care of everything, no matter how she treated you. And what did you tell her? I told her that respect should never be realized in hindsight, that it should be practiced daily, in the moment, when it matters. For the first time in our entire relationship, Richard Moreno wasn't arguing with me. He wasn't trying to prove I was wrong, wasn't defending Isabella's behavior, wasn't making excuses for his family's treatment of me. He was actually agreeing with me. She wants to talk to you, Marcus. She wants to try to work things out. I know. She's been calling. Are you going to talk to her? I looked around my house, my peaceful, drama-free house where I could eat dinner without being ignored, watch TV without being dismissed, and go to bed without wondering what I'd done wrong that day. Maybe, but not because she's struggling, and not because she finally realizes what she lost. If I talk to Isabella, it'll be because she's learned something about respect that goes deeper than just missing her lifestyle. Richard was quiet for a long moment. That's fair, Marcus. That's more than fair. When we hung up, I realized something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't the problem that needed to be solved. I wasn't the one who needed to change, compromise, or try harder. I was finally the one whose boundaries were being respected. For months, that's how long it took Isabella to figure out that pride doesn't pay rent and entitlement doesn't cover car insurance. For months of living in the real world where your charm doesn't get you a discount at the grocery store and your magnetic personality doesn't convince landlords to waive security deposits. 4 months of discovering that when you've spent 3 years treating your husband like an ATM with legs, you might actually have to face some consequences for that choice. The call came on a rainy Tuesday in March. Not a dramatic storm or anything cinematic, just one of those steady drizzles that makes everything look gray and makes you want to stay inside with a good book and a cup of coffee. I was doing exactly that when my phone buzzed with Isabella's name. Her actual name this time, not Gabrielle's phone or Dad's phone, like the previous dozen times she'd tried to reach me. Marcus? It's Isabella. I know. Your name came up on my phone. A pause. In the old days, that would have been her cue to launch into some speech about how I was being cold or unreasonable. Instead, she just took a breath and kept going. I was wondering, could we meet somewhere? Just to talk. About what? About us. About what I did. About what I said. Her voice was different, smaller, less certain, like someone who'd been knocked down a few pegs and was still figuring out how to navigate from a lower altitude. I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like a chance to explain. I looked out my window at the rain, at my peaceful neighborhood where I could now walk around without wondering if the neighbors were judging me for not being good enough for the woman who lived in my house. I thought about Clara and Jonah, who'd been sleeping better at my place, laughing more, acting like kids instead of walking on eggshells around an adult who might roll her eyes at them for existing too loudly. Okay, coffee shop on Maple Street, Saturday at 10 a.m. 1 hour. Thank you, Marcus. Really, thank you. Saturday morning came with one of those perfect spring days that makes you believe in new beginnings and second chances. I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early, Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be settled and centered before whatever conversation we were about to have. I ordered my usual black coffee, found a corner table, and watched Isabella pull into the parking lot in a Honda Civic that had definitely seen better days. She walked in looking like a completely different person from the woman who'd left my house 4 months ago. Gone were the designer clothes and the perfect hair and the general air of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around her comfort. This Isabella looked tired, a little worn around the edges, like someone who'd been learning some hard lessons about how the world actually worked. "Hi," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "Thanks for agreeing to meet. You said you wanted to explain. So explain." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to draw warmth from it. And for a moment, she looked younger, more vulnerable than I'd seen her since those early days when I thought we were building something real together. "I was cruel to you, Marcus. Not just the night I said I didn't respect you, but for months before that. Years, really." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Actual remorse. Not the performative kind designed to get her way, but the real thing that comes from understanding the weight of your own actions. "I took everything you did for granted. I treated your generosity like it was my right instead of your choice." "Yes, you did. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I didn't understand what I was doing. I thought love meant never having to worry about money or bills or any of the practical stuff because someone else would always take care of it. I thought respect was something you earned once and then just had forever. And now I know that respect is something you give every day in 1,000 small ways, or you lose it. I know that when someone takes care of you, it's not because they have to, it's because they choose to. And when you make someone feel like their choice doesn't matter, like they're just a provider instead of a partner, they stop choosing you." I sipped my coffee and studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, the little tells that would indicate this was just another performance designed to get her life back to the comfortable level she preferred. But what I saw was something different, a woman who'd been broken down by reality and was trying to figure out how to build herself back up into someone worth respecting. "Isabella, I appreciate you saying all of this. I really do. But apologies don't undo 3 years of being treated like I wasn't good enough for you, while simultaneously being expected to fund your lifestyle. I know they don't." She leaned forward, her eyes serious. "I'm not asking you to take me back, Marcus. I'm not even asking for another chance, not yet. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you, to us. I wanted you to know that you were right to draw that line, to refuse to accept being treated that way. That was unexpected. I'd been prepared for tears, for promises to change, for elaborate schemes to win me back. I hadn't been prepared for her to tell me I'd been right to kick her out. What are you asking for then? Time. Space to become someone who actually deserves your respect instead of just expecting it. I got a job, not a great one, but it's a start. I'm living in a studio apartment that's about the size of our old walk-in closet, and I'm learning to budget and pay bills and take care of myself like an actual adult." She smiled, and for the first time in years it looked genuine. "It's humbling as hell, but I think I needed to be humbled. And after you've learned all these life lessons, after I've learned them, really learned them, not just intellectually but in my bones, maybe we could try again. Not picking up where we left off, but starting over. Building something based on actual mutual respect instead of whatever it was we had before." I finished my coffee and looked at this woman who'd been my wife, who'd shared my bed and my house and my life, while making me feel like I wasn't worthy of basic human decency. She was different now, that much was clear. Whether she was different enough, whether the change was deep enough and permanent enough to matter, remained to be seen. "Isabella, I'm not the same man who bought you that engagement ring 3 years ago. I'm not the man who would subsidize his own disrespect because he was so desperate to be loved that he'd accept being tolerated instead. That man is gone. I know, and honestly, I'm glad he's gone. You deserve better than what I gave you." We sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd shared a life trying to figure out if there was anything left worth salvaging. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now you continue learning how to be someone worth respecting. And I continue being someone who won't accept anything less than that. Maybe someday those two people will be compatible. Maybe they won't. But either way, I'm not compromising on the respect part ever again." She nodded like she understood, like she finally got it. That's fair. That's more than fair. As we left the coffee shop and walked to our separate cars, her Honda Civic, my BMW that I no longer had to share with someone who treated me like hired help, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: possibility. Not certainty, not the desperate hope I'd clung to during our marriage, but genuine possibility. Maybe Isabella would continue growing into someone capable of the kind of respect that made love meaningful. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe we'd find our way back to each other on terms that actually worked for both of us. Maybe we wouldn't. But for the first time in my adult life, I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't settle for anything less than what I deserved. I'd rebuilt my life with my kids, with peace in my home, with the knowledge that boundaries weren't suggestions, they were requirements. Love without respect was just expensive loneliness. And I was done paying that price. Whether Isabella figured out how to offer something better remained to be seen. But I'd already won the only prize that really mattered, myself back, and that was more than enough to build a life on. Your little experiment is worthless, my wife's dad, the boss, declared at a meeting. As he signed the papers, my phone buzzed. Quantum tech patent approved. Bidding starts at $3.7 billion. I smiled. About that signature. So there I was, sitting at this ridiculously long mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars, trying not to let my sweaty palms leave marks on the polished surface. The whole setup screamed corporate intimidation 101. You know, the kind of boardroom where dreams go to die and middle managers practice their soul-crushing speeches. My laptop sat open beside me like a faithful sidekick, filled with months of research that apparently nobody gave two shits about, and my carefully organized notes that I'd spent half the night perfecting, because, hey, I'm nothing if not prepared for my own execution. Henry Aldrich, my dear father-in-law and the CEO of Aldrich Dynamics, sat at the head of the table like some kind of corporate king, twirling his stupid Mont Blanc fountain pen with all the theatrical flair of a wannabe Shakespeare villain. God, I hated that pen. He bought it for $3,000 just to sign documents that ruined people's lives, and he treated it like Excalibur or some shit. The man had this whole routine down to a science. The dramatic pause, the condescending stare, the way he'd lean back in his leather throne and survey the room like he owned everyone's souls. Which, to be fair, he pretty much did. The boardroom was packed tighter than a subway car during rush hour. Directors in their identical gray suits sat around the table like a jury of corporate zombies, their faces showing about as much emotion as a dead fish. Henry's personal assistants hovered nearby, probably calculating how many zeros would be in their Christmas bonuses for witnessing this public humiliation. And then there was Claire, my loving wife, sitting there with that smug little smile plastered across her face like she'd just won the lottery. Her diamond earrings caught the fluorescent lights every time she moved her head, sending little sparkles dancing across the wall like a disco ball at a funeral. Those earrings, by the way, cost more than my entire lab setup. I knew because I'd bought them for our anniversary last year, back when I still thought she gave a damn about me or my work. Now they just served as a constant reminder of how naive I'd been, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the woman I married might actually support her husband's career instead of actively sabotaging it. Your little experiment is worthless, Henry declared, his voice booming across the room with all the subtlety of a freight train hitting a brick wall. He slid a stack of transfer documents across the table toward me, and I swear the papers made this ominous sliding sound, like the whisper of death itself. We're cutting our losses before this embarrassment costs us any more money. Claire's smirk widened, and I could practically hear her internal victory dance. She'd been waiting for this moment, like a vulture circling roadkill. Hell, she'd probably been planning it since the day I first pitched my quantum stability algorithm to the board 6 months ago. I remembered that day clearly, how she'd sat in the back of the room, filing her nails and rolling her eyes every time I got excited about a breakthrough. Real supportive wife material right there. Global Tech is offering $2 million, Henry continued, his tone suggesting he was doing me the favor of a lifetime. Which, frankly, is more than this nonsense deserves. You should be grateful someone's willing to pay anything for you. He paused, searching for the perfect insult, science fiction fantasies. 2 million. The man said it like he was announcing the cure for cancer. Meanwhile, The other directors nodded along like bobbleheads in a hurricane, probably relieved they wouldn't have to pretend to understand quantum physics anymore. I'd seen this routine before. Henry would make his dramatic pronouncement. Everyone would agree because disagreeing meant career suicide, and then they'd all go back to their offices to gossip about the crazy son-in-law who thought he was the next Einstein. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Once, then twice. I tried to ignore it because, basic meeting etiquette and all that, but the damn thing kept going off like a car alarm. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Claire shot me a look that could have melted steel, probably thinking I was getting calls from creditors or something equally embarrassing. Henry's eye twitched. The man hated interruptions almost as much as he hated admitting he was wrong about anything. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Sorry, let me just... I pulled out my phone, expecting to see some spam about extending my car warranty, or maybe my mom asking if I'd eaten lunch. Instead, I saw a message from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. My heart damn near stopped beating. Patent approved. Breakthrough status. Initial bidding starts at $3.7 billion. I read it again. Then a third time. Billion. With a B. Not million. Billion. As in, enough money to buy a small country or fund NASA for a few years. I almost started laughing right there in the middle of Henry's big dramatic moment. The timing was so perfect it felt like divine intervention, like the universe had decided to play the ultimate practical joke on my asshole in-laws. I looked up at Henry, who was still holding his precious pen, having just signed his name to those transfer documents with a flourish that would have made John Hancock jealous. The man was practically glowing with self-satisfaction, probably already planning how he'd spin this story at the country club. Cleaned house today, he'd tell his golf buddies. Got rid of some dead weight. About that signature, I said calmly, sliding my phone across the polished table toward him. The device made this satisfying little skidding sound as it came to rest right in front of his shocked face. The silence that followed was absolutely golden. You could have heard a pin drop in that boardroom, if pins made sounds when they hit imported Italian marble floors. Henry's face went through about 17 different shades of confusion as he read the message, his eyes getting wider with each word. Claire leaned forward, squinting at the screen like she was trying to decode hieroglyphics. What? Henry started, but his voice cracked like a teenage boy asking someone to prom. 3.7 billion, I repeated, savoring each syllable like fine wine. Not million, Henry. Billion. With a B. The number that comes after million? The one with 9 zeros instead of 6. And that, folks, was the moment Henry Aldridge realized he'd just signed away his company's claim to the biggest technological breakthrough of the century. His hand started shaking so hard that precious Montblanc pen of his clattered onto the table like a dead bug. The room went dead silent, and I mean cemetery at midnight silent. You could have heard a mouse fart in that boardroom. Claire's smug-ass smile didn't just disappear. It completely imploded, like a demolished building collapsing in on itself in slow motion. Her jaw dropped so far I was genuinely concerned she might dislocate something. And those expensive diamond earrings of hers stopped sparkling because she'd gone completely statue still. Henry's hand was shaking around that pretentious Montblanc pen like he was having some kind of corporate seizure, and his face had gone from its usual pompous red to a sickly shade of green that reminded me of expired milk. The directors around the table leaned forward like a pack of hungry wolves who'd just caught the scent of fresh meat. Their dead fish expressions had suddenly come alive with dollar signs practically glowing in their eyeballs. I could practically hear their brains doing the math. 3.7 billion split however many ways, minus taxes, plus bonuses, carry the one. These people could smell money from 3 states away, and right now the boardroom reeked of it. Not million, I said softly, letting the word hang in the air like a bad smell. Billion. I drew out that beautiful B word like I was savoring a perfectly aged whiskey. God, it felt good. I'd been waiting months to drop this bomb, and the explosion was even more spectacular than I'd imagined. Claire made this weird, choking sound, like she was trying to swallow her own tongue. She'd been mid-sip on her glass of wine, some overpriced French shit that probably cost more than most people make in a week. And now she was coughing and sputtering like she'd just inhaled liquid fire. Red wine splashed across her pristine white blouse, and I had to bite my lip to keep from grinning. That blouse probably cost $1,000, and now it looked like she'd been in a bar fight. That's impossible, Henry stammered, finally finding his voice. The great Henry Aldrich, CEO extraordinaire, master of the universe, sounding like a confused kindergartner who'd just learned that Santa Claus wasn't real. You can't. We own, the company funded. See, that's where you're wrong, Hank, I said, using the nickname I knew he absolutely despised. The man's eye twitched like he'd been electrocuted. Let me break this down for you in terms even a CEO can understand. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the moment. This was better than Christmas morning, better than winning the lottery, better than finding out your ex got fat and bald and works at a gas station. This was pure, undiluted justice served ice cold with a side of fuck you. The patent for my quantum stability algorithm, I began, speaking slowly like I was explaining quantum physics to a golden retriever, was registered under my name. My personal name. Not Aldrich Dynamics. Not the company. Me. David fucking Thompson. I rarely swore in professional settings, but this felt like the right time to make an exception. But the funding. Claire started, her voice cracking like thin ice. Yes, the funding, I interrupted, holding up one finger like a professor about to deliver a lecture. Every single cent that went into this project came from my grandmother's trust fund. You remember Grammy Thompson, right, Claire? The sweet old lady you said was charmingly quaint and probably senile? Well, turns out her quaint little nest egg was worth about $12 million, and she left every penny of it to me. Claire's face went white as fresh snow. She remembered those comments, all right. She'd made them at Grammy's funeral, thinking the old woman was just some broke retiree with a house full of cats and doilies. Turned out Grammy had been quietly investing in tech stocks since the 1960s and never mentioned her portfolio to anyone except her lawyer. I kept meticulous records, I continued, pulling a thick manila folder from my briefcase. Every receipt, every invoice, every payment. My lawyer's been documenting everything for the past 18 months. Not one red cent of Aldrich Dynamics money touched this project. Not for equipment, not for materials, not for the lab space I rented across town, not even for the coffee I drank while working on it. Henry's mouth was opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The transfer documents he'd been so proud to sign suddenly looked like what they were, worthless pieces of paper signed by a man who had no legal right to transfer something he didn't own. You can't do this, Claire whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. She knew I could. Hell, she was probably already calculating how much alimony she'd lose in the divorce that was definitely coming after this shit show. Actually, I can, I said cheerfully. In fact, I already did. See, while you were busy planning my professional funeral, I was busy making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. My intellectual property, my funding, my patent. The holy trinity of go fuck yourself, Henry. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down with theatrical casualness. Another message from the patent office. Google Incorporated raising initial bid to $4.0 billion. Microsoft submitting competing offer. Apple requesting private meeting. The directors around the table made this collective gasping sound, like a choir of asthmatics having simultaneous attacks. For billion. With AB. These people were looking at numbers so big they probably needed calculators just to count the zeros. For billion now, I announced casually, like I was discussing the weather. Funny how competition works, isn't it? Supply and demand, basic economics. Though I guess they don't teach that in MBA programs anymore. Henry finally found enough of his voice to croak out. This is betrayal. Your family. Family. I laughed, and it wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh that could cut glass and make small children cry. Henry, you've treated me like something you scraped off your shoe since the day I married your daughter. You've undermined my work, dismissed my ideas, and made it clear that you thought Claire married beneath her station. And Claire. I turned to look at my dear wife, who was still dabbing wine stains from her ruined blouse. Well, Claire's made it pretty obvious that she's been waiting for an excuse to trade up to someone with a bigger bank account. The truth hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone in that room knew exactly how the Aldrich family had treated me. The snide comments at dinner parties, the eye rolls during presentations, the way they'd introduce me as Claire's husband, instead of using my name, like I was some kind of accessory. My phone buzzed a third time. Amazon was now in the bidding war. For $0.5 billion and climbing. I stood up slowly, gathering my notes and closing my laptop. The transfer documents that Henry had signed with such theatrical flair were still sitting on the table, but now they looked like what they'd always been, garbage. Legal toilet paper signed by a man who'd just discovered he'd been playing checkers while I was playing chess. Gentlemen, I said to the shell-shocked board members, ladies, it's been enlightening. I'll be in touch through my attorney regarding the transition of ownership. Oh, and Henry. I paused at the door, savoring this final moment. You might want to update your LinkedIn profile. I hear the job market's pretty competitive these days. And with that, I walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a table full of people whose entire world had just been turned upside down by the quiet, underestimated son-in-law they'd never bothered to take seriously. By 7:30 the next morning, the board of Aldridge Dynamics had convened what they were calling an emergency session, which was corporate speak for holy shit. We're fucked and need to figure out how to unfuck ourselves before the market opens. I'd barely gotten 3 hours of sleep, not because I was stressed, but because I kept waking up with this stupid grin on my face, replaying yesterday's boardroom massacre in my head like highlights from the Super Bowl. Henry was already planted in his usual spot at the head of the table when I walked in, looking like he'd aged about 10 years overnight. His perfectly styled silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and he had these dark circles under his eyes that made him look like a raccoon who'd been hit by a garbage truck. The man was clearly running on pure rage and espresso at this point. His face was still that lovely shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was somewhere in the stroke risk zone. And Claire was perched next to him like some kind of designer vulture, whispering poison in his ear. The sight of them huddled together, probably plotting my demise, should have made me nervous. Instead, it just made me want to laugh. These people still thought they were playing the same game we'd been playing yesterday, not realizing that the rules had completely changed and I was now the one holding all the cards. I strolled into that boardroom like I owned the place, which, as it turned out, I basically did, but we'll get to that juicy little detail in a minute. Right behind me came Marcus Hale, my attorney, carrying what looked like enough legal documentation to choke a horse. Marcus was one of those lawyers who looked like he could argue with God and win. The kind of guy who wore $1,000 suits and charged by the minute for breathing in your general direction. But he was worth every penny, especially for moments like this. Good morning, everyone, I said cheerfully, taking my usual seat at the table like nothing had changed. Beautiful day, isn't it? I love the smell of corporate desperation in the morning. Henry's eye twitched. Claire looked like she was sucking on a lemon that had been marinating in vinegar. The other board members sat around the table looking like they'd all been collectively kicked in the nuts by life itself. Marcus, bless his cold legal heart, didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and started distributing thick legal binders to each person around the table, moving with the efficiency of a man who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Each binder hit the polished wood with a satisfying thunk, and I watched the directors' faces go pale as they realized just how much paperwork was about to ruin their day. Inside those binders, Marcus announced in his courtroom voice, "You'll find documented proof of Mr. Thompson's patents, complete records of his independent funding sources, and most importantly, a clause that was embedded in Aldridge Dynamics' corporate charter. Specifically, Clause 47, Paragraph 3. The room went quiet except for the sound of pages rustling as everyone scrambled to find the relevant section. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment like fine wine. This was the part I'd been looking forward to since I'd first discovered that little legal landmine buried in the company's founding documents. Clause 47, Paragraph 3. Marcus continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who could quote legal precedents in his sleep, states that in any attempt to misappropriate intellectual property created by an employee or contractor, majority voting shares would automatically transfer to the creator of said property. This clause was written into the charter by Henry Aldridge himself, ironically, to protect the company from employees stealing ideas. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Henry had basically set up his own corporate death trap 20 years ago, probably never imagining that it would one day be used against him by his own son-in-law. I could see the exact moment the realization hit him. His face went from red to white to green in about 3 seconds flat. That's impossible. Claire shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that probably shattered windows in nearby buildings. This is manipulation. This is fraud. This is legal, Marcus interrupted smoothly. Completely and utterly legal. The moment your father signed those transfer documents yesterday, attempting to give away intellectual property that didn't belong to the company, he triggered Clause 47, Paragraph 3. Congratulations, Mr. Thompson. You now own controlling interest in Aldridge Dynamics. The silence that followed was absolutely beautiful. I'm talking about the kind of silence that comes right before a nuclear explosion, the moment when everyone realizes that their entire world is about to change forever. Henry's mouth was hanging open, so wide I was worried he might catch flies, and Claire looked like she was having some kind of breakdown. But wait, folks, it gets better. There's more, I said, pulling out my tablet with the theatrical flair of a magician revealing his final trick. See, I've been documenting some interesting behavior patterns for the past year. Amazing what people will do when they think nobody's watching. I started clicking through a slideshow that I'd been putting together for months. Security footage, recorded conversations, email screenshots. I'd been collecting evidence like a detective on steroids. The first slide showed Claire entering the office at midnight 3 months ago, using her executive access to break into the R&D files. Turns out, while Henry was busy dismissing my work as a science fiction, his darling daughter was stealing research data and selling it to competitors, I announced casually. Funny how that works, isn't it? Claire's face went from white to green. You were spying on me? Sweetie, I wasn't spying, I said with mock sympathy. I was protecting my intellectual property. There's a difference. See, when your husband starts acting like James Bond, it's usually because his wife is acting like Benedict Arnold. The next slide showed Claire meeting with executives from 3 different tech companies, passing along stolen research in exchange for what looked like briefcases full of cash. The slide after that showed her forging my signature on documents, trying to transfer patent applications to shell companies she'd set up. For the past year, I continued, I've been attending board meetings disguised as janitors, coffee servers, and maintenance staff. Turns out when you dress like the help, rich people literally don't see you. It's like having an invisibility cloak made of minimum wage. I clicked to another slide showing myself in a janitor's uniform, emptying trash cans right behind Henry as he discussed plans to get rid of the dead weight with other executives. Another slide showed me in a barista outfit, serving coffee while Claire bragged to her friends about how she was going to upgrade to a richer husband once my project failed. You people never even noticed me, I said, shaking my head in amazement. I was right there, listening to every conversation, recording every betrayal, documenting every illegal activity. And you treated me like furniture. Henry finally found his voice. This is entrapment. This is illegal surveillance. Actually, it's not. Marcus interjected with the satisfaction of a man who lived for moments like this. All recordings were made in public spaces or company property where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. Everything here is completely admissible in court. The board members were looking around the table like they were trying to figure out which lifeboat to jump into first. These people could smell a sinking ship from miles away, and right now the SS Aldridge was taking on water fast. My phone buzzed. Another message from the patent office. The bidding war was now up to $6 billion and climbing. Tech giants were literally throwing money at each other trying to get their hands on my algorithm. So here's how this is going to work, I announced, standing up and straightening my tie. Henry, you're going to clean out your office. Claire, you're going to pack your shit and find somewhere else to live. And the rest of you are going to learn what it means to work for someone who actually gives a damn about innovation instead of just padding the quarterly reports. I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. Welcome to the new Aldridge Dynamics, folks. Try not to fuck it up. I wasn't done yet. Not even close. While everyone was still processing the bombshell that I now own their asses, I had one more present to unwrap for this delightful little family gathering. The best part about revenge isn't the initial strike. It's watching your enemies realize just how deep the rabbit hole goes, how thoroughly they've been outplayed, and how spectacularly they've underestimated the quiet guy they've been shitting on for years. Oh, Claire, I said sweetly, clicking to the next slide with all the enthusiasm of a kid on Christmas morning. We haven't even gotten to the good part yet. My darling wife was sitting there looking like she'd been hit by a freight train full of karma, her face cycling through about 12 different shades of panic. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the table, and I could practically hear her brain short-circuiting as she tried to figure out how much legal trouble she was in. Spoiler alert, it was a lot. The new slide filled the conference room's massive wall-mounted screen with a detailed timeline that would have made the FBI jealous. Names, dates, dollar amounts, and photographs, all meticulously organized like a serial killer's murder board, except instead of tracking victims, I'd been tracking corporate espionage and patent theft. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced like a game show host revealing the grand prize. I present to you the complete record of Claire Aldridge Thompson's greatest hits. And by hits, I mean the careers she destroyed, the researchers she sabotaged, and the innovations she buried to protect her own mediocre ass. The first name on the list was Dr. Sarah Chun, a brilliant materials scientist who'd been working on revolutionary battery technology 3 years ago. Claire had gotten her fired by planting evidence that she was selling trade secrets to Chinese competitors. The truth, which I'd uncovered through some creative investigative work, was that Claire had been the one selling secrets, and she'd framed Sarah to cover her tracks. Sarah Chun, I said, letting the name hang in the air like an accusation. Ring any bells, sweetheart? Brilliant woman, groundbreaking research, mysteriously fired right before her patent applications were approved. Those patents, by the way, somehow ended up filed under your name 6 months later. Claire's face had gone so pale, she looked like a vampire who'd been living on a diet of nothing but fear and regret. That's not. I never. Oh, but you did. I interrupted, clicking to show email screenshots that would have made a prosecutor weep with joy. I've got your emails, your bank records, even the receipts from the restaurant where you celebrated screwing over yet another colleague. You had the surf and turf, if I remember correctly. $90 lobster to celebrate destroying a woman's career. Classy. The directors around the table were looking at Claire like she'd just revealed herself to be the corporate equivalent of a serial killer. Which, in a way, she kind of was. Instead of bodies, she left behind ruined careers and stolen dreams. But the principle was the same. I clicked to the next name, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, a computer engineer who'd been developing quantum encryption algorithms. Claire had sabotaged his lab equipment and then blamed the resulting data loss on his incompetence. She'd gotten him blacklisted from the entire tech industry while quietly stealing his research and selling it to defense contractors. Marcus Rodriguez. I continued my little presentation of horrors. Remember him? The guy whose lab mysteriously suffered that equipment malfunction that destroyed 6 months of research? Funny thing about security cameras, they see everything, even when people think they're being sneaky. The slide showed grainy but clear footage of Claire sneaking into Rodriguez's lab at 2 in the morning, systematically destroying equipment and wiping servers. She was wearing all black like some kind of corporate ninja, but her distinctive walk and that ridiculous designer handbag gave her away immediately. "You bitch," whispered one of the directors, a gray-haired woman named Patricia who'd apparently worked with Rodriguez. Marcus was brilliant. He had 3 kids to feed, and you destroyed him for what? A few million in stolen patents. Claire was openly crying now, mascara running down her cheeks like black tears. But I wasn't feeling particularly sympathetic. This woman had spent years systematically destroying innocent people's lives to advance her own career, and now she was upset because she'd finally been caught? Please. The slideshow continued. Dr. James Park, whose revolutionary solar cell design Claire had stolen and buried because it would have made her own energy division obsolete. Dr. Lisa Washington, whose AI research Claire had sabotaged because she was afraid of being shown up by someone younger and smarter. Dr. Robert Kim, whose medical device innovations Claire had stolen and sold to pharmaceutical companies for kickbacks. The list went on, a parade of brilliant minds whose work had been stolen, whose careers had been ruined, whose innovations had been buried. Also that Claire could maintain her position as head of the innovation division without actually having to innovate anything herself. 12 researchers, I announced, letting the number sink in. 12 brilliant minds, representing probably 50 years of combined experience and research, all destroyed by one selfish, talentless parasite who couldn't stand the thought of actually earning her position. Henry was staring at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time, and what he was seeing clearly horrified him. "Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't." "She did," I said firmly. "Every single bit of it. And here's the beautiful part. She documented everything herself. Emails bragging about her strategic personnel decisions. Text messages to her friends about eliminating the competition. Bank records showing payments from companies that mysteriously received stolen research data shortly after each firing. The board members were whispering among themselves, their voices rising in anger as they realized the full scope of what Claire had done. These people might have been corporate sharks, but they understood the difference between ruthless business practices and outright theft. What Claire had done wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my lawyer. FBI contacted. Formal investigation opening. Multiple felony charges likely. "Oh, and Claire," I said, showing her my phone screen. "The FBI is very interested in having a chat with you. Something about wire fraud, corporate espionage, and racketeering. Apparently, destroying people's careers while stealing their intellectual property is frowned upon by federal authorities." Who knew? Claire let out this weird, keening sound, like a wounded animal realizing it was trapped. "You can't do this to me. I'm your wife. I'm family." Henry slammed his fist on the table so hard that everyone's coffee jumped. "Family," he roared, his face turning that dangerous shade of purple that meant his blood pressure was approaching liftoff. "You destroyed this company. You destroyed innocent people. You're a goddamn criminal. She's your daughter." I shot back, standing up and leaning across the table. "This is the family you chose over integrity, over innovation, over doing what's right. This is what you get when you value profit over people and politics over progress." The security team I'd called earlier, because I'd learned to plan ahead, entered the boardroom right on cue. Two professional-looking guys in dark suits who moved with the kind of confidence that comes from years of dealing with corporate criminals. "Ms. Thompson," one of them said politely, "we need you to come with us. You have the right to remain silent." As they read Claire her rights and escorted her out of the boardroom, she turned back to look at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll pay for this." I smiled and waved goodbye. "No, sweetheart. You already paid. With interest." With Claire being walked out of the boardroom like some white-collar criminal from a Law and Order episode, you'd think the drama was over. But honestly, I was just getting warmed up. The best part about having spent 2 years planning this corporate coup wasn't the revenge. Though that was pretty damn satisfying, it was finally getting to reveal the ace I'd been hiding up my sleeve this entire time. "All right, everyone," I said, walking over to the wall panel that controlled the room's lighting and presentation systems. "Now that we've cleared out the trash, let's talk about why you're all going to want to keep your jobs and maybe even start taking me seriously for once." I dimmed the lights with theatrical flair that would have made Henry proud, if Henry hadn't been sitting there looking like someone had just told him Santa Claus was a registered sex offender. The massive wall screen flickered to life, and what appeared made everyone in that room stop breathing for about 5 seconds straight. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced with the kind of grin that probably made me look slightly psychotic, "I present to you Project Genesis." The screen showed architectural blueprints that looked like something out of a James Bond movie. Cross-sections, floor plans, and 3D renderings of what was clearly an underground facility that put NASA's mission control to shame. This wasn't some dingy basement lab with second-hand equipment and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like corpses. This was a full-scale, state-of-the-art research complex that stretched out like an underground city. The gasps from around the table were absolutely music to my ears. These people had spent so much time looking down on me that they'd never bothered to wonder what I was actually doing with my time. While they were playing corporate politics and stabbing each other in the back, I'd been building the future right under their noses. "What the hell is that?" Patricia whispered, leaning forward so far she almost fell out of her chair. Her reading glasses were practically steamed up as she tried to process what she was seeing. "That," I said with the satisfaction of a magician revealing his greatest trick, "is a fully operational quantum research facility located approximately 200 feet directly beneath my modest little lab across town. The one you all assumed was just me playing with chemistry sets and delusions of grandeur. Henry's mouth was hanging open so wide I could see his dental work. That's impossible, he managed to croak. Something that size, the permits alone would cost millions, the construction, the equipment. 3 football fields, I interrupted cheerfully. That's how big it is. 3 full football fields of the most advanced quantum research equipment on the planet, staffed by some of the brightest minds in theoretical physics, computer science, and applied mathematics. You know, the kind of minds that Aldrich Dynamics has been systematically firing and blacklisting for the past 5 years. The next slide showed the funding breakdown, and I watched several board members' eyes bug out like cartoon characters. The numbers were staggering, not just because of the amount, but because of where the money had come from. Private investors who actually believed in innovation rather than quarterly profit margins. Tech billionaires who understood that sometimes you had to spend money to change the world. Government grants that I'd secured by actually proving my concepts worked instead of just promising they might work someday. Funded entirely through my grandmother's trust and a consortium of private investors. I continued, savoring every word. $67 million in initial investment, with an additional $40 million in equipment and staffing over the past 18 months. All completely independent of Aldrich Dynamics, all completely legal, and all completely mine. The third slide showed the construction timeline, with time-lapse photography that made the whole project look like some kind of engineering miracle. Crews working around the clock, massive equipment being lowered through specially constructed shafts, concrete being poured into forms that would make ancient Roman architects weep with envy. "How did you keep this secret?" asked Robert Chun, one of the younger board members who actually seemed impressed rather than just terrified. "Something this size, this many people involved. How did nobody notice?" "Compartmentalization," I explained, clicking to a slide that showed the project's organizational structure. Each construction crew only knew about their specific section. Equipment suppliers thought they were fulfilling orders for multiple smaller projects. The permits were filed under 17 different shell companies across 3 states. And most importantly, everyone involved signed NDAs with penalty clauses that would bankrupt small countries. But the real showstopper came when Dr. Sofia Ramirez stepped into the boardroom. I'd been wondering when she'd show up. We'd planned this entrance perfectly, timing it right after the construction reveal for maximum impact. Sofia walked in like she owned the place, which in a way, she kind of did. She was my head of research, my second in command, and the woman who'd helped turn my theoretical algorithms into working reality. The look on Henry's face when he saw her was absolutely priceless. Sofia had been one of Aldrich Dynamics' most promising physicists 3 years ago, right up until Claire had gotten her fired for insubordination. The real crime? Sofia had refused to let Claire steal her research on quantum field manipulation, and she'd made the mistake of documenting Claire's attempts at theft. "Hello, Henry," Sofia said with a smile that could cut glass. "Fancy seeing you here." Henry looked like he'd just seen a ghost, if ghosts wore lab coats and carried tablets full of world-changing research data. "Sofia, but we terminated. You illegally terminated me for refusing to participate in intellectual property theft," she corrected smoothly. "Fortunately, David here offered me a position where I could actually do science instead of playing corporate politics." Sofia walked over to the presentation screen and pulled up a new set of slides that made everyone's previous gasps sound like whispers. Technical diagrams, test results, and performance metrics that looked like science fiction made real. "With David's quantum stability algorithm," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 3 years proving the impossible, "we've created the world's first stable, room-temperature quantum computer. Not a prototype that works for 30 seconds under ideal laboratory conditions. Not a proof of concept that might work someday if we're lucky. A fully functional quantum processing unit that fits in a laptop case and operates at normal atmospheric pressure and temperature." The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before a nuclear explosion. These people were looking at technology that would make current computers look like stone tools, processing power that could solve problems in minutes that would take traditional supercomputers decades to crack. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the patent office. Current bidding at $7.2 billion. Department of Defense requesting immediate consultation. Chinese delegation offering state-level negotiations. $7.2 billion. The number was so big it didn't even feel real anymore. We were talking about enough. Money to fund entire countries' annual budgets, to solve global problems, to literally change the world. The prototype is ready, Sophia continued, and I swear I could hear the stock market having a collective heart attack from 30 floors up. We've successfully demonstrated stable quantum entanglement, perfect error correction, and processing speeds that exceed our wildest projections. We're not just ahead of the competition. We've lapped them so many times they can't even see our dust. I looked around the boardroom at all these people who'd spent years treating me like an inconvenient relative who couldn't take a hint. Henry, who'd dismissed my work as science fiction. The board members who'd rolled their eyes every time I tried to explain quantum mechanics. The executives who'd made jokes about my fantasy projects behind my back. Now they were all staring at me like I'd just pulled the Hope Diamond out of my ass and announced I was opening a jewelry store. Questions? I asked innocently. Henry's face went through more color changes than a chameleon having an identity crisis. First red, then white, then this sickly green shade that reminded me of expired guacamole. He was gripping the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles had gone bone white, and I could practically see the gears grinding in his head as he tried to process the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Those scientists, Henry finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking like a 13-year-old boy asking someone to prom. They were terminated. Fired. Gone. We made sure they could never work in this industry again. See, that's where you're wrong again, Hank, I said, using that nickname that made his eye twitch like he'd been electrocuted. You didn't fire them. You illegally terminated them. There's a pretty significant legal difference between the two, and my lawyers have been documenting every single wrongful termination case for the past 3 years. I clicked to the next slide, which showed an organizational chart that looked like a who's who of scientific brilliance. Every name on that chart was someone who'd been screwed over by Aldrich Dynamics, someone whose career had been derailed by corporate politics and Claire's systematic sabotage campaigns. Dr. James Park, your former head of renewable energy research, I announced, pointing to the first name on the list. Fired for budget reasons right after he developed solar cells with 93% efficiency. He's now my director of sustainable technology, and his patents are worth about $800 million. Henry's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He remembered James, all right. The man had been one of their most promising researchers until Claire had convinced Henry that he was too expensive and not a team player. The real reason? James had refused to sign over his patent rights to the company. Dr. Lisa Washington. I continued, enjoying the way Henry flinched at each name. Terminated for performance issues after she developed AI algorithms that could predict market trends with unprecedented accuracy. She's now running my financial modeling department, and her work is why I knew exactly when to file my patents for maximum impact. The slide showed Lisa's breakthrough research, algorithms so sophisticated they made Wall Street's best prediction models look like magic 8 balls. She tried to present her work to the Aldrich board 2 years ago, but Claire had sabotaged the presentation by accidentally corrupting the data files right before the meeting. Dr. Robert Kim. I went on, my voice getting stronger with each revelation. Fired for restructuring reasons after he developed medical devices that could detect cancer cells with 98% accuracy using nothing but a smartphone camera. He's now my head of biomedical research, and his work is going to save about 1 million lives per year. Each name I read was like another nail in Henry's coffin. These weren't just random employees who'd been let go during budget cuts. These were the best and brightest minds in their respective fields, and Henry had thrown them all away because his daughter was too insecure to work alongside people who were smarter than her. The people you discarded, I said, my voice taking on an edge that could have cut through steel. The researchers you blacklisted, the innovators you destroyed, they're all working for me now. Every single brilliant mind that Aldrich Dynamics threw away like garbage is now part of something bigger, something better, something that's going to make your little corporate empire look like a lemonade stand. Henry was shaking now, and not just his hands. His whole body was trembling like a leaf in a hurricane as the full magnitude of his mistakes hit him. All those terminations he'd signed off on, all those careers he'd destroyed at Claire's urging, all those innovations he'd buried, they were all coming back to haunt him. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. I pulled out a manila folder that had been sitting in my briefcase like a loaded gun, waiting for this exact moment. The folder was thick, stuffed with documents that represented months of careful investigation and legal preparation. I slid it across the table to Henry with the kind of casual gesture you'd use to pass the salt. "Your retirement package," I announced cheerfully. "I'd suggest you read through it carefully and sign it before the SEC and FBI finish their investigations." Henry's hands shook as he opened the folder, and I watched his face go from green to gray as he read through the contents. Inside were termination papers, pension documents, and a very detailed list of all the illegal activities that had been happening under his watch. Corporate espionage, patent theft, wrongful termination, securities fraud. The list went on for pages. "This is extortion," Henry whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. He knew he was fucked, and he knew I had him dead to rights. "No, Henry," I corrected gently. "This is consequences. You spent 20 years building an empire based on intimidation, theft, and the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened your position. You created a corporate culture where innovation was punished and conformity was rewarded. You let your daughter turn the company into her personal piggy bank while she destroyed careers for fun. This is just the bill coming due." The board members were looking back and forth between Henry and me like they were watching the world's most expensive tennis match. I could practically see them calculating their own survival odds, wondering which side of this corporate war they needed to be on to keep their jobs. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down to see another message that made me smile. The stock price was going absolutely insane. Aldrich Dynamics stock was climbing so fast the trading algorithms couldn't keep up. We were looking at the biggest single-day gain in the company's history, and it was all because the market had figured out that the quiet son-in-law everyone had been ignoring was actually a genius. $8.3 billion now, I announced casually, showing my phone to the room. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Tesla are all in a bidding war for exclusive licensing rights. The Pentagon is offering a blank check for military applications. China just called offering to trade 3 provinces and their national debt for the technology. Henry looked like he might actually pass out. The man who'd built his entire identity around being the smartest guy in the room was realizing that he'd been played by someone he'd never even bothered to take seriously. "The board of directors," I continued, standing up and walking around the table like a predator circling wounded prey, "has exactly 30 seconds to decide whether they want to be part of the new Aldrich Dynamics or if they'd prefer to update their resumes. Because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to be sitting in that chair." I pointed to Henry's seat at the head of the table. "And anyone who's not on board with the new direction can clean out their offices." I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. These people had spent years treating me like furniture, ignoring my ideas, dismissing my contributions, and generally acting like I was some kind of charity case that Claire had dragged in off the street. Now they were all staring at me with the kind of respect that only comes from absolute terror and the sudden realization that their entire future depended on staying in my good graces. "All in favor of the new management structure," I said, raising my hand. "Say aye." The chorus of "aye" that followed was so unanimous you'd have thought they were voting on free pizza for everyone. 1 month later, walking through the Aldrich Dynamics headquarters felt like stepping into a completely different universe. Gone was the oppressive corporate atmosphere where innovation went to die and ass-kissing was considered a core competency. The place was buzzing with actual energy now, the kind of electricity you feel when brilliant minds are finally free to do what they do best without some trust fund princess sabotaging their work every 5 minutes. The first thing I'd done after officially taking over was tear down Henry's ridiculous executive fortress on the top floor. That pretentious corner office with its marble floors, imported leather furniture, and walls lined with awards for business excellence got gutted faster than a fish at a sushi restaurant. In its place, we'd built something that would have given the old Henry a heart attack. Transparent laboratory spaces where anyone could see the actual work being done. No more closed-door meetings where careers went to die. No more secret handshakes and golf course deals that determined who got funding and who got fired. Everything was out in the open now, because when you're actually doing groundbreaking science instead of playing corporate politics, transparency becomes your best friend rather than your worst enemy. Dr. Sofia Ramirez had transformed the entire 15th floor into what looked like mission control for launching rockets to Mars. Banks of quantum computers hummed quietly in climate-controlled chambers, their processing power so intense they could solve mathematical problems that would have taken traditional supercomputers until the heat death of the universe. The walls were covered with white boards filled with equations that looked like someone had taken calculus and beaten it to death with theoretical physics. "How are the climate simulations coming along?" I asked Sophia as I walked through her domain, watching her team of formerly blacklisted scientists work their magic. "We solved the Pacific Ocean temperature modeling problem yesterday," she said with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather instead of announcing a breakthrough that climate scientists had been struggling with for decades. "Turns out when you have quantum processing power that doesn't choke on massive datasets, you can predict weather patterns 6 months out with 97% accuracy." 6 months. The best meteorologists in the world struggled to predict weather accurately beyond 5 days, and my team had just extended that timeline by a factor of 36. The implications were staggering: crop planning, disaster preparedness, energy grid management, shipping routes. We were looking at technology that could prevent famines and save thousands of lives from natural disasters. Down on the 12th floor, Dr. James Park had turned what used to be Claire's innovation division. And I use that term loosely since the only thing she'd ever innovated was new ways to steal other people's work into a renewable energy research paradise. Solar panels that looked like they belonged on alien spacecraft covered every available surface, feeding power back into the building's grid and making our monthly electric bills look like pocket change. "The protein folding breakthrough is working better than we projected," James called out as I walked through his lab. He was standing in front of a holographic display that showed molecular structures rotating in three-dimensional space, their bonds and interactions mapped out in real time by our quantum computers. "We're looking at drug development timelines that are about 50 times faster than current industry standards." 50 times faster. The pharmaceutical industry typically took 15 years and billions of dollars to develop new medications. We were talking about reducing that to months instead of decades, turning drug discovery from a slow-motion marathon into a sprint. Cancer treatments, Alzheimer's research, rare disease cures, all suddenly within reach instead of perpetually 5 years away, like they'd been for the past 50 years. The best part wasn't just the scientific breakthroughs, though those were pretty damn spectacular. The best part was watching the people who'd been crushed by Henry and Claire's regime come back to life. Scientists who'd been working dead-end jobs at community colleges were now leading research teams that were literally changing the world. Researchers who'd been blacklisted from the industry were publishing papers that were getting cited thousands of times before the ink was even dry. Dr. Lisa Washington had taken over the 8th floor and turned it into what looked like the world's most sophisticated financial war room. Her AI algorithms were running continuously, analyzing market trends, predicting economic shifts, and managing investment portfolios with success rates that made Wall Street's best hedge fund managers look like children playing with monopoly money. "The encryption systems are making banks nervous," Lisa mentioned as I stopped by her workstation. "We've created quantum encryption that's literally mathematically impossible to break using any known computational methods." The NSA called twice today asking if we're planning to share with friendly governments or if they need to start planning for a world where their current surveillance methods are obsolete. The irony wasn't lost on me. A month ago, these same government agencies had been perfectly happy to let Aldrich Dynamics stagnate under Henry's leadership, probably figuring that American technological superiority was safe as long as we kept throwing money at the same old approaches. Now they were scrambling to understand how a company they'd written off had suddenly leapfrogged decades ahead of everyone else. My phone buzzed constantly with requests from reporters, government officials, foreign delegations, and corporate executives who all wanted to understand how the hell we'd pulled off this transformation. The bidding war for our quantum computing patents had reached $12 billion and was still climbing. Tech companies that had been dismissing quantum computing as 10 years away were now offering to buy entire divisions just to get access to our research. But the most satisfying calls were from Claire's former victims. The researchers she'd destroyed, the innovators she'd buried, the brilliant minds she'd driven out of the industry. Dr. Sarah Chun had called to thank me personally for clearing her name and restoring her reputation. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez was collaborating with our security division to develop quantum encrypted communication systems. Dr. Robert Kim was working with our biomedical team to integrate his cancer detection technology with our processing power. Every single person whose career Claire had destroyed was now thriving, their work finally getting the recognition and resources it deserved. Meanwhile, Claire herself was sitting in a federal detention center awaiting trial on enough felony charges to keep her busy for the next couple of decades. Henry had quietly signed his retirement papers and disappeared to his beach house in the Hamptons, probably spending his days drinking expensive scotch and wondering how the quiet son-in-law he'd dismissed as worthless had managed to outplay him so completely. The man who'd built his identity around being the smartest guy in the room had been checkmated by someone he'd never bothered to take seriously. The revolution wasn't just technological, it was cultural. Instead of a corporate hierarchy built on fear and intimidation, we'd created a collaborative environment where the best ideas won regardless of who thought of them. Instead of quarterly profit reports that prioritized short-term gains over long-term innovation, we were focused on solving problems that would matter 50 years from now. And for the first time in my adult life, I walked through those office hallways knowing that I wasn't the overlooked husband, the dismissed son-in-law, or the quiet guy everyone ignored. I was the man who'd taken a dying company and transformed it into something that would change the world. I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office, Henry's former throne room that I converted into something that actually resembled a workspace instead of a shrine to corporate ego, when my secretary buzzed in with news that made me damn near spit coffee all over my computer screen. "Sir, Margaret Aldridge is here to see you," she said through the intercom, her voice carrying that special tone people use when they're delivering news that's somewhere between surprising and potentially apocalyptic. Margaret, Claire's mother, Henry's wife, the woman who'd perfected the art of looking down her nose at people from such great heights that she could probably see their dandruff from orbit. In all the years I'd been married to her daughter, Margaret had spoken to me exactly 14 times, and most of those conversations had consisted of her asking me to fetch her coat or move my car because it was cluttering up the circular drive. "Send her in," I said, curious as hell about what could possibly bring the Queen of Aldridge Dynasty social climbing to my office. The last time I'd seen Margaret, she'd been at Claire's arraignment, sitting in the gallery looking like someone had just told her that caviar was actually fish eggs, and poor people had been eating it for centuries. The woman who walked through my office door was not the Margaret Aldridge I remembered. Gone were the designer suits that cost more than most people's cars, the pearl necklaces that could probably fund a small country's education budget, and that perfectly coiffed hair that looked like it had been styled by angels who charged by the hour. Instead, she was wearing a simple navy blazer that looked like it came from an actual store where normal humans shop, and her hair was, well, it looked like hair. Just regular, human hair that hadn't been sculpted into submission by a team of professionals. But it was her eyes that really threw me. Margaret Aldridge had always looked at the world with the supreme confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in her entire privileged life. Now she looked tired, older, and for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely uncertain about something. "David," she said simply, and even her voice was different. No condescension, no barely concealed disgust, no tone that suggested she was doing me a tremendous favor by acknowledging my existence. Just weariness. "Margaret," I replied, gesturing to one of the chairs across from my desk. "This is unexpected." She sat down carefully, like someone who'd recently discovered that the world was more fragile than she'd previously believed. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the desk where her husband had once held court like some kind of corporate emperor. "We dismissed you," she said finally, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her properly. "All of us. From the very beginning, we dismissed everything about you. Your work, your ideas, your potential. We treated you like..." She paused, searching for the right words. "Like you were some kind of charity case that Claire had dragged home out of misplaced sympathy." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? She was absolutely right, and we both knew it. "We were wrong," she continued, and those 3 words carried more weight than anything she'd ever said to me before. Catastrophically, completely, inexcusably wrong. Margaret reached into her purse, a simple black leather bag that probably cost less than what she used to spend on lunch, and pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had seen better days. She placed it on my desk with the careful reverence someone might use when handling historical documents. "I found this in Henry's study when I was cleaning out his papers," she said, "hidden in the back of his filing cabinet, behind his golf tournament trophies." I opened the folder, and what I saw inside made my chest tighten with emotions I hadn't expected. Photocopies of my early sketches, equations I'd scrawled on napkins during family dinners, research notes I'd shared with Henry years ago when I'd still been naive enough to think he might actually listen. Page after page of my work, carefully organized and preserved, dating back almost to the beginning of my marriage to Claire. "Even then," Margaret said, her voice starting to tremble, "even in those early days when you were just starting to develop your theories, you were trying to show us. You brought Henry those equations, remember? You tried to explain your ideas about quantum stability during Christmas dinner 3 years ago. You were so excited, so passionate about the possibilities." I remembered. God, how could I forget? I'd been like a kid showing off a science fair project, genuinely believing that my father-in-law might be interested in what I was working on. Instead, Henry had barely glanced at my notes before dismissing them as theoretical nonsense and changing the subject to stock prices. "We didn't listen," Margaret continued, and now there were actual tears in her eyes. Tears. From a woman I'd never seen display any emotion stronger than mild annoyance at the help bringing the wrong vintage of wine. We were so convinced that we knew better, that our way of doing business was the only way that mattered. We couldn't see past our own arrogance long enough to recognize genius when it was sitting at our dinner table. She reached across the desk and touched the folder gently, like it was something precious that might crumble if handled too roughly. "You could have changed everything, David. If we'd just listened, if we'd just given you the support and resources you needed instead of treating you like an inconvenience. Imagine what we could have accomplished together." The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. Here I was, sitting in Henry's chair, running the company he'd built, commanding the respect he'd always craved, and his wife was finally acknowledging that the son-in-law they'd dismissed as worthless had been the key to everything they'd claimed to want. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked quietly. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands like they held answers to questions she was still learning how to ask. "Because I need you to know that not all of us were blind by choice. Henry was so invested in being right about everything that he couldn't admit when he was wrong. And Claire." Her voice broke slightly. "Claire was so threatened by anyone who might outshine her that she turned sabotage into an art form." She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, genuine remorse. "But I should have known better," she said firmly. "I should have seen what you were capable of. I should have stood up to Henry when he dismissed your work. I should have protected you from Claire's machinations. I should have been the mother-in-law you deserved instead of the one you got stuck with." I felt something inside my chest loosen, a knot of resentment I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. This wasn't the apology I'd expected to receive, mainly because I'd never expected to receive one at all. "What do you want, Margaret?" I asked, not unkindly. She straightened up slightly, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the formidable woman she'd always been, just pointed in a different direction now. "I want to help," she said simply. "I want to make amends. I want to take my father's charitable foundation, the one that's been funding country club renovations and society galas for the past 20 years, and turn it into something that actually matters. I want to fund young innovators, support researchers who are getting dismissed by people like we used to be, give brilliant minds the resources they need to change the world." She leaned forward earnestly. "I want to make sure that the next David Thompson doesn't have to wait 10 years and stage a corporate revolution just to get someone to take his ideas seriously." And for the first time since this whole saga began, I found myself genuinely surprised by a member of the Aldrich family. 3 months later, the boardroom that had once been the site of my corporate execution had transformed into something that looked like mission control for launching humanity into the next century. The same mahogany table where Henry had tried to flush my life's work down the toilet was now surrounded by scientists, researchers, and government officials who were practically vibrating with excitement over breakthroughs that were happening faster than we could document them. The morning briefings had become the highlight of my day, mainly because every single report sounded like science fiction that had decided to become reality just to prove the skeptics wrong. Today was no different, except that the numbers were so ridiculous they'd stopped feeling like real money and started feeling like high scores in some cosmic video game. Cancer trials are showing success rates we've never seen before, Dr. Sofia Ramirez announced, pulling up holographic displays that made the room look like the bridge of a starship. The quantum-enhanced targeting system can identify and eliminate malignant cells with 98.7% accuracy while leaving healthy tissue completely untouched. 98.7%. Traditional chemotherapy had success rates that made coin flips look like sure bets, and we'd essentially turned cancer treatment into a precision surgical strike. The implications were staggering. Millions of lives saved, families that wouldn't have to watch their loved ones waste away, children who'd grow up with grandparents instead of just photographs. How soon before we can start human trials? Asked Dr. Patricia Wong, our new head of medical ethics. Patricia was one of those people who'd been blacklisted from the industry for having the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, medical research should prioritize saving lives over maximizing profits. FDA fast-tracked approval came through yesterday. Sophia replied with the kind of grin that could power small cities. First patients start treatment next Monday. Next Monday. We were talking about technology that would revolutionize medicine, and it was happening next Monday. Not in 5 years, not after decades of additional research, not, maybe someday, if we're lucky. Next goddamn Monday. But the cancer breakthrough was just the appetizer. The main course came when Dr. James Park stood up to deliver his report on what he was calling Project Lazarus, our carbon capture and climate reversal initiative. The atmospheric processing models are working better than our most optimistic projections, James announced, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd just figured out how to save the world. The quantum-enhanced molecular manipulation can extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into useful materials at a rate that would reverse global warming within 15 years. 15 years. Climate scientists had been saying we had maybe 50 years to prevent catastrophic global warming, and James had just casually announced that we could reverse it in less than 2 decades. The technology was so efficient it could literally suck greenhouse gases out of the air and turn them into building materials, creating an economy based on cleaning up the planet instead of destroying it. My phone, which had become less of a communication device and more of a continuous stream of increasingly absurd offers, buzzed with another notification that made me laugh out loud. The European Union was offering to trade their entire renewable energy grid for exclusive licensing rights. China had called offering to make me an honorary citizen and throw in a few provinces for good measure. The UAE wanted to buy the entire company for what they called a number with many zeros. But the call that really got my attention came from NASA. They want to discuss something they're calling Project Starshot, my secretary had mentioned during the morning briefing. Something about quantum propulsion systems and getting to Mars in 6 weeks instead of 6 months. 6 weeks to Mars. The same journey that currently took the better part of a year, we could potentially do in the time it takes to get really good at a new hobby. Space exploration had just gone from a slow crawl to a sprint, and apparently we were the ones holding the starting gun. The really delicious part wasn't just the scientific breakthroughs, though. The really satisfying part was watching the corporate vultures who'd been circling our patent portfolio realize that we weren't playing the same game they were used to. Google is offering $18 billion for exclusive licensing, announced Marcus, my lawyer, reading from a tablet that looked like it was about to catch fire from all the incoming offers. Microsoft wanted $22 billion. Apple just submitted what they're calling a blank check with a smiley face drawn on it. $22 billion. With AB, we were talking about enough money to fund small countries, solve global hunger, or buy Twitter and turn it into something useful. But every single offer got the same response from me. Not interested, I said, leaning back in Henry's old chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game that most people didn't even know they were playing. We don't sell revolutions. We lead them. The looks of confusion from some of the newer board members were priceless. These were people who'd spent their entire careers thinking in terms of quarterly profits and shareholder value, and they couldn't comprehend turning down billions of dollars just because it wasn't enough money. But sir, stammered Robert Chun, one of the directors who was still adjusting to the new reality. $18 billion is more money than most corporations will see in their entire existence. Robert, I said patiently, our quantum computing patents alone are worth more than the gross domestic product of most nations. The cancer treatment technology could generate trillions in revenue over the next decade. The climate reversal system is literally priceless because you can't put a price tag on saving the planet. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where construction cranes were working around the clock to build the manufacturing facilities we'd need to scale up production. We're not just sitting on the next generation of technology. We're sitting on the next evolution of human civilization. And you want to sell that for what amounts to pocket change. The stock price was breaking records daily, climbing so fast that trading had to be halted twice just to let the computers catch up with the numbers. Financial analysts were running out of superlatives to describe what was happening. The phrase unprecedented growth had been used so often it had lost all meaning. But the sweetest moment came when the news broke about Claire's plea bargain. Your ex-wife officially pled guilty to 17 felony counts. Marcus mentioned casually, like he was discussing the weather. Wire fraud, corporate espionage, racketeering, and conspiracy. She's looking at 25 years minimum, and the judge denied bail pending sentencing. 25 years. The woman who'd spent our entire marriage undermining my work and planning my professional assassination was going to spend the next quarter century making license plates and learning why orange really wasn't her color. Henry, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale told in business schools about the dangers of letting ego override judgment. The man who'd built his identity around being the smartest guy in the room had been completely outmaneuvered by the son-in-law he'd dismissed as worthless. As I looked around that boardroom at all the brilliant minds who'd been cast aside by the old regime, all the innovations that had been buried by corporate politics, all the world-changing technology that was finally getting the resources it deserved, I realized something important. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This had become something bigger, something that would outlast all of us and change the trajectory of human history. Standing in what used to be Henry's office, now mine, I stared out at the city skyline that had become a monument to second chances and vindicated dreams. The morning sun caught the glass facades of the new research facilities we'd built, each one representing another breakthrough that had started as a dismissed idea in some corporate boardroom where innovation went to die. On the wall behind my desk hung a sight that would have given Henry a stroke, my patents displayed right next to the original Aldrich Company charter, side by side like old friends who'd finally found their way home. The quantum stability algorithm that had started this whole revolution was framed in simple black, nothing fancy or pretentious, just the mathematical proof that sometimes the quiet guy in the corner is the one who's going to change everything. My phone buzzed with another message from the lab. Clinical trials approved for Alzheimer's treatment. First patients ready for quantum-enhanced neural repair. I smiled, remembering all those family dinners where Henry had dismissed my work as playing with equations, while his wife nodded along like a bobblehead in a hurricane. The directors who used to roll their eyes when I spoke now stood up when I entered the room, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for someone who'd proven that crazy ideas sometimes turn out to be brilliant ones. The wife who'd mocked my fantasy projects was now sitting in a federal prison, probably wondering how the hell her meal ticket had turned into her worst nightmare. The father-in-law who'd called my life's work worthless nonsense had faded into obscurity, forgotten by an industry that had moved light years beyond his limited imagination. And me? The quiet, underestimated husband who'd spent years being treated like an inconvenience at his own family gatherings was now leading a technological revolution that would reshape human civilization. Because sometimes the people they laugh at the loudest, dismiss the quickest, and underestimate the most completely are the ones who end up rewriting the future while everyone else is still trying to figure out what the hell just happened.